My name's Oliver. I will be moderating the presentations today. Our first presentation is going to be from Camila Vergara, who is speaking on rhizomatic socialism and sortition. We're then going to have Violeta Garrido, who's going to be talking about the epistemic demands of representative democracy, followed by Suryamayi Clarence-Smith, who's going to be talking about the experience of the Oroville Citizens Assembly, what we can learn from that, the prefigurative politics of that. And then in place of Christiana Mauro, who unfortunately is recovering from surgery, we are going to have Thomas Kirkland, who is going to be presenting on, I believe, the same subject, from grand cause platforms to embedded constituent power, about the development of different sortitional institutions. And then at the end, we'll have a panel discussion. I'll take us through to the end of the conference, which will be at 7 p.m. UTC, so not 7 p.m. for any of us. But I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation, and I'm glad to see so many people here. All right, so we'll give it 5 minutes, and then Camila, you can start. People are still turning up, so kick off at 10 past as planned. So this conference is going to be recorded today by Benny Nissen. Unfortunately, the recording system is such that it can't actually hear anything he says, so he's going to be a bit of a silent partner. But many thanks to Benny for putting in that sterling service. As Richard's put in the chat, the International Network of Sortition Advocates, INSA, we're a volunteer organization. We're dedicated to linking together pro-sortition organizations, academics thinking about sortition, activists pushing for reform around the world. And so this conference is really aimed at building some of those bridges and connecting people together. And so you're all invited to join our Discord. For which the link is in the chat and will be repeatedly put in the chat. I've pinned it. We are a volunteer organization. It's free to join. We don't keep membership roles. You just show up or don't. And hopefully we can make productive connections with one another and help advance the cause of radical democracy and sortition around the world. So if you've just joined us, you're invited to let us know who you are in the chat. You know, what's your name, where are you based, what's your background and involvement with socialism or with sortition. As I say, INSA is about helping connect people and share resources and generally build up the institutional network of advocates for sortition increase the general level of knowledge and understanding of sortition among institutions and organizations. So please do jump in the chat and let us know where you're coming from. So we'll be starting in just a couple of minutes. All right, I think it's about time we got started. So our first speaker is Dr. Camila Vergara of the University of Essex. She is the editor of Theoria, a journal of social and political theory, and associate editor of critical sociology. Has recently published Systemic Corruption, Constitutional Ideas from an Anti-Oligarchical Republic. It's a very good book, full of interesting ideas and a great resource for the for sortitionists of every stripe, but especially on the left. Camila, take it away.
Thank you so much. So thank you for this invitation. I am glad that we can share ideas and how to think critically about sortition and how can it actually have an impact in today's political system. My experience is going to come from my theoretical background, but also from my empirical and activist background in Chile. So I'm originally from Chile. I participated in the constituent process in a remote way from England, but basically I was the advisor of councils and assemblies and grassroots leaders in terms of first how to create the rules of the game of how decisions are made in the constituent assembly, and then how to integrate mechanisms of direct democracy and popular ways of organizing within the constitution. So this was my role, and I learned a lot from it. And the presentation is kind of part of the kind of philosophical framework of what I experienced there. So I'm going to share my screen and get some slides. So I have titled this presentation Rhizomatic Socialism because I have been working a little bit on the integration between plants and the architecture of plants as a horizontal way of sharing energy and information through grids, as a way of organizing popular power, and not as the way that we have been organizing in the past, which is basically more a tight organization based with leadership and kind of a more hierarchical way of understanding. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sortition, rotation, and collective action, but from in this kind of perspective. So first, I want to refer to the diagnosis. In my work, I refer to what we have today is not a democracy, but an oligarchic democracy, a regime in which basically a few people are empowered by our votes. We elect them, but not we don't have any power, really. These people that we elect in general, and I'm talking about almost every democracy around the world, except maybe for the Scandinavians that have a more tight system, in which this basically the few people that we empower, they do not rule for the majority, but they legislate, rule, and adjudicate. We're talking about the three systems of power in democracies are basically systematically favoring the rich or being neglectful in a way in favor of the many. And there's always a zero-sum game here. It's always at the detriment or against the interests of the common people. So we have created in this way this very highly extractivist oligarchic state in which the state itself exploits their citizens through unfair taxes and exploitation of natural resources. And it's colluding basically with the powerful few to further enrich themselves and plunder the spaces in which people are sources of labor, and also spaces in which basically nature is being exploited. So oligarchy exploits for labor and natural resources for, of course, for profit. So I have been thinking about where are we at in a way in terms of our systems. And basically, when we think about social democracy and the Nordic countries especially, we have a social democracy in which 50% of the population, so 90% of the population owns at least 50% of the wealth. There's kind of a marker there in which more than that, it is turning slowly into a liberal democracy, not a social one, in which basically we have only formal rights, not really social rights. So you have, the right to an education, but you really need to pay for your school, for example, or the right to health, but you need to, have a health insurance. And if you don't have, you cannot really have access to it. So there's two ways of kind of organizing the society. However, the majority of democracies today are oligarchic democracies, as I said, in which basically even that those formal rights are being violated, and there is kind of fall onto more illiberal practices. And we're seeing it today, the elections in the United States and elsewhere, basically between a rock and a hard place, in which there is really little progress, and there's little we can do around the edges. So it's very easy for this oligarchic democracy to become an illiberal oligarchy, basically where the few really govern for their own good and with their own benefit without much justification. We have been seeing now in social media things that might have in the past unseated a precedent. Now they're kind of normal and they're normalized, right? On the other end, we have, and I am a scholar of populism being the old 19th century people's movement, working class movement, in which basically a more material democracy is advocated. And that is kind of like the reaction to this oligarchic democracy, and we kind of, there's a pendulum between back and forth, and now we are basically in the oligarchic democracy realm. It's very difficult to move forward. So I have a why we are here. I have explored this idea with the problem of corruption. There's three types of corruption: individual, institutional, and what I bring in that is like systemic corruption. So the individual, of course, we know the bad apples, the people that commit the bribery, the fraud, and they're public officials involved in illegal actions, and it's measured by the law. Then we have the institutional corruption, which is maybe basically when institutions themselves start functioning in a way that is against their own basis, in a way. The public purposes are distorted by private interests. We can see, for example, the health industry as a way, instead of serving the health of the people, making a profit for insurance, for example. So the whole system basically works in a corrupt manner. And then we have the systemic corruption, in which basically the majority of laws today are being done to benefit disproportionately the powerful. And those rules tend to either promote or reproduce the inequality that exists, or even promote it further. So we have a form of structural domination with an oligarchization of power, the concentration of power in few hands. And there's not much we can do from within the system. So I want to bring kind of sortition and this rhizomatic approach as a kind of getting out of this systemic corruption. So I here bring Machiavelli as a theorist of corruption. And for him, there are basically three elements in our societies: the matter, the form, and the methods. The matter is basically citizen individuals, which, you know, we are individual neoliberal individuals, in a way that we have been indoctrinated into a very hierarchical way of organizing society, and we are very comfortable basically with some inequalities. We define ourselves as more consumers and citizens, in a way, in this society. However, it's not the fault of the individual, but Machiavelli says first we need to look at the form. The form of course, I already talked about this: laws and institutions, basically, that instead of promoting inequality, promote inequality, allowing, for example, for capital gains not to be taxed, or for, you know, huge bonuses, or the gap between, you know, labor and capital, or the managerial class and the rest. The gap has grown exponentially in the last 40 years. So those forms do not allow for the matter to be, in a way, organized, or at least directed in a manner that is more productive of society. However, Machiavelli says that at the end, what promotes really corruption are the methods, the procedures through which we allocate power. And he, in his 14th century, 15th century theory, he understood elections in the Roman Republic, as well as in Florence, as a vehicle for corruption. And this is striking, because we have understood elections as the basis of our democracy. We even define in political science democracy as free and fair elections. However, elections, as we know from history and from practice, they have been the favorite or preferred method for oligarchic democracies or aristocratic governments. Not democracy. Democracy has been based on lottery, sortition. So basically, we have put these elections as our pillar of our society, as our political system. And Machiavelli says that one of the problems of elections is the self-selection procedures or nature. This is, is double-sided. On the one hand, it allows for natural leadership to just emerge, and basically you put yourself as a candidate and you can actually run for office and make a difference. However, what ends up happening is that the self-selection means that the few are always self-selected because they have the time and the money and the resources. So at the end, there's a kind of pre-selection based on wealth and status, which at the end undoes all the unravels basically what is good about elections. He also mentions free speech as a problem. Because basically, when you get to the top and you get to be part of the ruling elite, then you can use your speech in order to create or reproduce hegemonic structures. So therefore, the same as elections, when everybody has the same kind of openness, but some of us have more resources than others, then the speech of someone who has the resources basically becomes hegemonic or part of reproduction of that hegemony. And the majority who do not have a platform, they have speech freedom to speak, but they don't have any influence. And this is what matters in politics at the end, that your speech actually has an influence and your election actually creates change. So in terms of the methods, and this is just kind of analysis of history and practice, you have election as based on the selection of the best. We elect others that are better prepared than us, that have more, experience, that are better orators, they have a good rhetoric, they have a charisma, and they can reach people. There are many that they could have some expertise specifically, or because they are just high class and they have just some kind of social authority in a way. This procedure allows only for the best to serve, and here we're talking about the best circumstances in which we have kind of a natural aristocracy, what the kind of some of the founders would say about the United States, that this kind of system allows for a natural aristocracy, the government of the best. However, even if you have the best in power, they have a monopoly over the political knowledge. They are the only ones who know how to do politics, the only ones who have practice in it. So basically, they monopolize something that, as Aristotle says, is something part of human nature, which is to do politics and to exercise a political judgment. This, in addition to knowledge, this few through the elections, they concentrate power, because we empower them in order to make decisions that are binding for all of us, basically. So we not only are not knowledgeable in this system, but also we have no power. And then even if election has been put out as a kind of a way to go against corruption because of the kind of a constant rotation in office, what actually happens is that because money is, in order to be recognized as the best, you need resources, then this actually fosters corruption. So the more elections that we have, the more corruption we have, because we have more money into the race. And this whole system based on election has allowed for a no place for the people. The people have no place in politics. They only give the vote, and there's really little going on in terms of political power. On the other hand, we have rotation and sortition, and I understand it both as some kind of something that needs to go together. And I will talk about sortition as a form of technical solution that I'm very critical of. And for me, rotation or sortition act like mechanisms in order to allow for inclusive selection that is open to all and is not burdensome in a way, because there is a rotation and there's not like you're stick for like 4 years for a post, and you basically, this concentrates your knowledge. There's people rotating in and out, and therefore it creates a kind of collective knowledge. It is inclusive and expansive because you bring people in all the time in a way. Periodically, you can bring new people in, and those people, of course, need to be no experts on anything, because we learn collectively by doing. It allows for a dispersion of power, so therefore we can think about sortition and rotation as a form of an anti-oligarchic device, that if we use it, it tends to disperse rather than concentrate, so it is helpful in this manner. And again, it hinders corruption and co-optation, because basically there's very difficult to be co-opting someone that is rotating, or part of an office that is always rotating out, so you don't have like a fixed people or subject. So instead of having no place, we think about the people as network, as a kind of a web of different spaces. So how can we find kind of like, or what is this the connection between space and the procedure? So for me, going from an oligarchic democracy into a socialist republic, we really need to go from the no place to this kind of radical counter-hegemonic spaces as a network. We have today an ecosystem of different organizations. However, these organizations are communitary, local, more of the left in general, or tied to labor. They have, however, copied the form of organization that is oligarchic. So basically, people still in these organizations of the people, there is election and there's a separation between the grassroots and the leadership. So therefore, we tend to reproduce the same structures, and it's very difficult to not get phagocytated by the system when the inner logic of the popular power is basically the same logic as outside. And we try to kind of more limit it in order not to exploit the kind of leadership's part of it, or the hierarchical part. And there's always a struggle between horizontality and hierarchy. And this is a problem in a way, that we need to not only think about sortition as a form of editing the system that we have and making it better, but actually integrating it into the organization from below. So this rhizomatic politics, of course, comes from the book A Thousand Plateaus from Deleuze Guattari. And the idea is that we need to think about popular organization and political power from the grassroots, not as a tree, and not as a kind of a single stock, not as something that has a center and it needs to be concentrated and centralized, but as a dynamic process of existence, first of all, that the people in this network is not one people, is a collection of different expressions of, you know, organization at the local level, of we the people at the local level. And this process is always dynamic, and its growth is based on what they call a social desire that there exists. Today it is we have our individualism basically increased and in hyperbole, basically very high in our minds. Individualism is first. However, the social desire is still inside us in a way as neoliberal subjects. And when we engage in this kind of horizontal connection and community-based politics, we further and nurture the social desire. And the social desire is expansive. And this dynamic process have no single point of origin in a way. There's no center, and therefore there's no beginning and no end, which is kind of a continuum of a constant movement, a very dynamic process. So this allows for the thinking about a non-linear network, basically, that doesn't have a beginning and end, that doesn't have a direction, that grows on every direction, grows everywhere. So I think this is the way that we need to think about popular politics if we want to use sortition as a way to kind of hack the system that we have. So again, this is kind of the framework in which we think about. We have used philosophy and our kind of frameworks as they were trees. They were always informed by reality, by our roots, by the social movements, by community organization, by collective action on the ground. And this basically is brought up by, you know, intellectuals who create some kind of ideology systems in which, you know, parties are born, political parties as kind of the political branch of it. And then you have the leaves, which are all the leaderships and the different other organizations that come out of that kind of party structure. However, there's really no connection between the roots and the leaves in a way. Where the action happens all on the top, the social movements are just feeding and are powerless in a way. We need to think not as the sortition and the rhizomatic socialism as a form of a tree, and again another ideology that will branch out and kind of not have any connection, but really as a mycelium, as the kind of super conductors of made out of fungi in the earth, in which to which all of the plants are connected and they can pass information. So there is, if we think about this way, it is not just a unitary trunk in which some of the branches can diverge from that trunk, but these are really decentered forms of thinking in which we need to have respect for the organization of others and be able to connect in this network. So in a way, I wanted to kind of deconstruct a tree and kind of bring it, you know, together, leaves and roots touching and move. And not eliminate. I don't want to seem like I want to eliminate what exists. I'm a kind of very realist thinker in this manner. And for me, you need to add on to what we have, because as Machiavelli says, we cannot spend our political capital trying to destroy what is already there, because there's a lot of people profiting from that structure, but actually add on something new, which is always easier. And that new can actually undermine the system that exists. So instead of elections, we need to push for sortition and rotation. Instead of electing leaders, we need to be thinking about electing or selecting working groups. Instead of having a party that is hierarchical and has one kind of leadership and it's disciplined, we need a network in which progressive thinking and creative thinking can originate anywhere in this kind of multiple nodes of energy that make up the network. and therefore the kind of change can come from within, and there is new directions that can come in a very organic manner. And then instead of thinking about organizing the popular power, we need to think about coordinating it, because it already exists. We just need to look in a different manner and try to reach out to the people that are already meeting. Today, there's no, Marx would say there's no shop floor to organize. It's very difficult. People are atomized. So therefore, we need to connect this basically islands of freedom, as Arendt would say, in a network. So this is, with this I finish. I think sortition, for me at least, is not a technical solution. I am very critical of including citizen assemblies with no binding power into the system, or changing elections for sortition and thinking that that is going to fix the problem. I think that we are so too far out in terms of our systemic corruption. We need to add a counterpower. And I think sortition is integral to people's power, that the way people organize, not the elite. And it is crucial for the expansion of the network. We cannot think about expanding communitary organizations on the ground if we keep putting all the weight and the pressure on leaders or community organizers and not thinking about the community as needed to partake in a way that is not burdensome, but is actually enables you as a member of that organization to feel powerful in a way and to have a role. I think the liberal understanding of politics, in which the ruling elite, the apparatus in a way, is unburdening us as individuals from our political duties because we don't want to do it. In a way, we have taught that this is just burdensome, and this is a trap in a way. Comfort is the enemy, if you will. We need to be able to engage in some kind of work, and that work needs to be as light as possible. And for that, we need to bring more people together. And sortition allows for that kind of expansion of the network and inclusion of others. I don't think we can replace elections in the oligarchic system with sortition. And I said, resolve the problem of oligarchic democracy, but we need to incorporate new popular institutions. You can have, for example, a citizen assembly, but understood not as a complement to government, but actually as a separated power that needs to have its own authority. That if the citizen assembly decides something, that is the law. As Rousseau would say, the sovereign has spoken, and therefore government needs to act and not really question what has been decided. We have not reached that point yet, and we have only incorporated citizen assemblies as a way of making the oligarchic government work better. And we have seen in many other countries that these assemblies are used, they cherry pick basically what kind of decisions they like or not, and this undermines the popular structure, and it's not really going to change much. Then I don't think that we need to eliminate leadership. Many of the organizers that I met are kind of very against the vanguard and leadership. And I think that is a mistake, in the sense that we have organizers that, put a lot of effort, but they cannot lead. They need to lead from behind, basically. So therefore, if we think about sortition as a way of enhancing leadership by creating working groups that basically allow for leadership to be expansive in this manner, and everybody to be able to lead in a manner that, like the Black Lives Matter movement tried to do, I think that would allow for leadership to be stronger, because I would say we need leaders as interface with the system. So the system, how it works, there's always a spokesperson, there's always a point, a focal point. So that is kind of like the connector between the oligarchic system and the democratic socialist system. So we need some interconnection, and leadership is what is recognized. So we need to use that, but not be co-opted by that, and not be determined by the leadership structure. And finally, one of the arguments is that sortition basically doesn't allow for expertise to come up and basically express itself and contribute. And I think that sortition is not a denial of expertise, but actually it's democratization, because we are what we have. We know we are human beings that learn. We learn all the time, and the expertise needs to be shared. nobody is essential in a way. Everybody has equal political judgment, and we always can learn. And the idea is that we become more intelligent citizens, in a way, active citizens. And for that, we need to be put on the spot. We need to be able to learn from others that know more in a manner that is collaborative and not subordinating. So I want to leave you with that as a provocation of thinking about sortition, as I said, not in a manner of a technical solution that you fix a problem by incorporating this kind of cool device that has no power. And at the end is the president or the parliament who will allow basically that decision to go forward. But thinking about sortition as a way of hacking the system. How can we think about a structure that will really have some binding power? And I think thinking about in the national level is very difficult. Hacking the national system is very difficult, but hacking the municipal government or the local government is easier, because if you have some leader that actually can be open to editing the municipal code and intervening and putting procedures and maybe recognizing citizen assemblies within this structure and giving them individual power, giving them the power to decide really, and not subordinated to the structure and to the governors or the mayor's power, then you can really have a testing site in which you can have this cohabitation of government and then the people organized whenever it's needed and whenever the people want to speak in a way, in a more kind of deliberative manner. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Camila. That was a great talk. Now we're going to take some questions. We've got 15 minutes for questions. If you would like to ask a question, you can raise your hand with the button at the bottom of the screen. Or you can, if you don't want to speak, you can write your question in the chat and I will read it out. So Nicholas Kukoma.
Hi, everyone. Nicholas Kukoma here from Boston. Dr. Vergara, thank you so much for this presentation. My question is, are you aware of, or can you recommend any socialist thinkers or any scholarly writing that's been done that fully incorporates sortition, democracy with a socialist Republican political ideology of any kind? I've always been looking for that and haven't seen much, so would love any recommendations.
Well, not that I know of that integrates, but you can read pieces of the puzzle. So I would recommend Yves Saint-Omer, who is this French scholar. He has actually a new book out that was I can give you the title. I have to look for it. It was published 2 years ago in English. And basically, he's one of the historians of sortition and has more kind of a socialist approach and kind of how can we make it work today. Then you have James Muldoon, who is a colleague of mine in Essex. He wrote a book on, he worked on Republican socialism and assembly-based. And he now, I think he has incorporated sortition in the platform socialism book. I'm not really sure, but we're all kind of in the same page in terms of how can we integrate it into the framework in a way. And again, not like just like a technical solution. I would recommend if you want to read, because for me the sortition and how it could work is really the chapter on Condorcet on my book. He is really interesting because he was a constitutional thinker and he was not from the left. So he was a person, more like a logical human being, I would say, that was an elite himself. So basically he knew like the majority of people that he, knew and collaborated with were terrible. So he said, well, we cannot just give them power. We need to have more people, we need to have a network of, so he was, from him, I bring this idea of the network and how there's also other mechanisms that I didn't mention, but you can pair, sortition with, rank voting, for example, for different initiatives within organizations, for example. So he has he's the creator of rank voting. So he was so suspicious about the elite and leadership in general that for him the method was to how can we assure that the people that are less like remain outside, basically. So the election is not for the ones that we like the most, but the one that they're hated the least, basically. So this was kind of like his idea of leadership, but always, controlled by the people from below in a way. Yeah, sorry, I'm not a lot of enlightening in this way with the sortition, but there's a lot coming out now, I would say. There are more kind of technical solutions. There are some think tanks going around. I don't know if you know Democracy Next. I collaborated with them. I was very critical at the beginning because they based their approach through the book of Ellen Landemore, who is a professor from Yale, and it's kind of a non-binding situation in a way in which citizen assemblies can proliferate, and it's kind of like let's bring multiplicity. And it's not that we need more multiplicity. We need more people's power, from my perspective. So they have been transitioning because they understand that encouraging just this non-binding assemblies is not only not getting to change, but also is undermining the mechanisms, because basically people they start saying this is worthless. Why are we going to support this if there's worthless? With all the bad propaganda that comes from this experiment, if the experiment is bold in a way, and if you come with a result that power doesn't like, they're going to come out and saying these people are ignorant. Why are you going to they don't have no authority? And in reality, this is the problem. If you select a citizen assembly by sortition, and they make a bold decision, they don't have any authority. In a way, we are used, and authority is something constructed, right? It's not something that exists. So we have given authority to elections. So elections have their own legitimacy in a way. So we understand that whatever decision comes out of the elected officials is more authoritative than what comes from regular citizens selected by lot, because they're so small a number in a way. And we need to be able to build the authority from sortition-based institutions. So if we go into the non-binding and go too fast in a way and into the trend, we might be able to undermine in a way our own endeavor, because people will be more skeptical of a decision just made by 100 people that nobody knows in a way, and nobody selected, right, or nobody elected. So we need to be very careful on that regard. And I think there's not too much being done on the kind of authority legitimacy part. It's much to be done in that way. There's a lot of enthusiasm of kind of using the methodology and kind of like thinking outside of the box, but not really in how to transition there in a manner that is meaningful.
Thank you.
Great. Do we have any more questions from the audience? All right, so looks like Ian has a question. Go ahead, Ian.
Dr. Vergara, thanks so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it, and I agree that, yeah, we need to build legitimacy and also need to build true power and sortition rather than as a polling and an extravagant polling system for elected officials. I have been thinking a lot about how we advance legitimacy of sortition. And I think, as you mentioned, building like constitutional change at the federal level is very difficult. Building at the municipal level might be easier, but I also, and I think as many examples of well-functioning sortition that we have, the better. But I also think there's difficulty and uncertainty in transitioning local implementations to implementations at the sovereign level, at the national level, because ultimately sovereign control rests in the control of natural resources and land, to gatekeep those things, to control who has access to them, and how do you think what's the best way to make the jump from these examples at municipal levels that are essentially corporations within the sovereign to a sovereign level where there's real control of natural resources, land, the things that people actually depend on to survive?
Thank you for that question. First, how to kind of create it at the local level is easier. It is easier in the sense that, as I said, you can create a procedure for popular participation that basically you include in the code. You add an article, that says, well, for example, you can have a citizens initiative of something. And you say, okay, anytime that you have a citizen initiative, whatever the rules are, that issue needs to be resolved via a citizen assembly and then a referendum, for example. You can add my preference in addition to the citizen assembly, that if the citizen assembly decides something, then that needs to go to deliberation in local, assemblies. We need to have like a deliberation days in a way in which people can, be socialized into, that decision if they like it or not, and then a referendum. So you really own that initiative in a way, and there's no way that any in the government can say no to that. So if you have kind of an independent decision-making process within the local government, then it doesn't matter who comes to power, they need to, respect that. So that would be a huge win, okay? And that could be done through a leader that runs based on grassroots organizations that are the ones actually having all the power and forcing that leader to become honest. Because, I have to be honest myself in terms of like how, leaders sometimes are good and sometimes you don't know. People that that were very true in 6 months in power, they really change. And it happened to me in the Constituent Assembly. I advised 25-year-old historian, a history teacher at the school, a public school. She made it, and she was representing, her constituency, kind of like a small, groups of teachers and students and whatever. And then 3 or 4 months into the convention, she told me, well, I was selected to write the Constitution, not anyone else, me. And I'm like, well, you were, the people were behind you and they wrote articles and they want that article to go, you're a delegate in a way, you need to just put it there. But basically she wanted to write it herself, the kind of like ego in between. Yeah. So this is something that you need to, you need to have a kind of a written document in a way, forcing the leader to actually do these changes as soon as they come to office, and we're going to talk about a specific strategy for that. In terms of the national level, today, for example, if you think about pollution and water, today we have multiple local organizations, small, medium, even larger, that are water defendants, that are environmentally based, and they struggle at the local level and they don't win. Basically, they go to the court, they get injunctions, they get orders of protection from the corporation, and it's really disheartening. I collaborate with this organization called SELF-DF, which is the Community and Environmental Legal Defense Fund, and then are basically a group of organizers for the environment and for community rights, and they have been helping communities at the local level in different parts of the country to struggle for their basically rights and protect nature. However, they are completely weak in the sense, because basically the national and the corporate power is always stronger than something that is small. So if we think about organizing at the local level, having strongholds in fertile ground, if you think about planting seeds in fertile grounds and having this kind of nodes in different parts, today we can connect them and we can create a network of water defendants, a network of environmental and community funds that basically allow for having power at the regional level and the national level. And we need to be seen. Part of the problem of popular power is that there's no visualization. Power, from the very beginning, political power is all about imagery. It's all about, the optics. The king came with all, the garment, and it's all about the awe. You go to church and it's all about, how you're going to be awed by power. The people are nowhere in a way. So, and we do not take too much time. We're so busy in terms of doing that we don't take time in showing ourselves. The people don't record their things. We need to show to the world and to others that other world is possible. So if you can have these strongholds and show that it works, even if it's in a very, very small community, you can show it that it works. You can replicate it, and you can connect this local initiatives in a network, and then maybe build some power that can go against the national government or sovereignty, as you say. But at the end, the power of guns, there's not much to do in a way. You need to, that is like another step that I'm not going to talk about now, but it's like another step in the strategy. But first you need to organize and you need to make it possible for people to make it real in a way, that this is not something that's pie in the sky, that actually you can build communities. I'm going to just tell a brief comment about brief story about a recent conference that I went in Italy, and they're very good at community organizing for energy there. So the European Union has all this kind of regulations for building cooperatives of energy. So communities that can become cooperatives, residents, and they can own their own energy. And they are experiments, and in just many years already in Germany specifically, of very small towns that have become 100% renewable, and they are all community based. And the community basically reinvests the money in the community. They have free transport, they have free childcare, they have all these things happening, but nobody knows about it. We don't know it, so we are not inspired by it. So part of the kind of the building power needs to be building it on the ground, but also visualizing it and showing it to the world. So that is kind of part of the strategy of building power, I would say.
Great. Well, thanks so much for that. I'm afraid we don't have time for any more questions right now. We're going to take a short break, but I guess 3-minute break. And then at 5:02, we're going to have Violeta Garrido, who will be talking on the epistemic demands of representative democracy, a critique of the oligarchic degenerations of elections. So yeah, I'll see you all in a couple of minutes, and then we'll have that talk. Thanks again, Camila. A fantastic talk.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Looking forward to the Q&A as well, or the panel discussion as well. So while we're waiting, obviously feel free to chat in the chat. If we will try to talk through voice chat, it might get a little chaotic. But that is what the chat is there for.
If I can comment, there's so super interesting the chat what Richard put on the educational environments. I think to make the legitimacy of sortition possible, people need to get acquainted to it. People need to actually do it. And part of my advice that I give to the councils and the assemblies and all these groups, they always struggle with numbers. They're always small, and they always try to reach out, and it's very difficult. So when I bring this idea of sortition from within, and that other more passive members that are not basically, they will not put their name forward, that they don't want to lead anything, but they are great in a way, they immediately are. You say, okay, we're going to do this randomly, and then we're going to all the people present, we're going to assign if you want to. And people start, collaborating. So their numbers grow immediately in a way. And there is kind of getting a habit of understanding that collective action in a way, and collective action, you don't need to have extraordinary leaders inside. You need to have just good brainstorming processes. and that is what I've been trying to kind of deepen in a way. What are those processes of brainstorming? That you don't want to think, for example, bureaucratically in a solution for something. You need to think groundlessness. You need to think about from an uncharted territory in order to come up with a creative solution. Because sometimes when we try to fix a problem, we are unable to, because we are thinking in the same parameter in a way, and we are unable to see from outside. So part of the, I'm working with this woman, is a biologist, on moral imagination, and basically how to help people really think outside of the box from scratch in a way, and not in this kind of oriented, goal-oriented way. So I think in the schools it would be super interesting to start from there in a way. So I'm very happy to hear.
All right. So it's now 5:04 UTC. Our next speaker is Violeta Garrido. Violeta is based at the University of Granada, and her talk is entitled "The Epistemic Demands of Representative Democracy: A Critique of the Oligarchic Degenerations of Elections." So, Violeta, take it away. We can't hear you. Can you? So can you try saying something? Is this just me having this problem, or is this?
Unfortunately, not. We can't hear you.
Yeah, I can't as well.
Okay. All right. Looks like so she's signed out. I assume she'll be signing back in just a second. So sorry about this. This was okay. So Violeta, you're muted there. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi, do you hear me? Hello? Okay.
Yeah, that's working fine.
Thank you very much. Sorry for this little inconvenience. Well, yes, today I want to talk about the epistemic demands on representative democracy. And I want to make like a critique of the oligarchic degeneration of the election procedure. And for do so, I'll use, among others, the term political fetishism, as understood by José Luis Moreno Pestaña, who is a colleague of mine. And he's also currently working on these questions, like me, especially on sortition and everything. Well, in politics, the fetishistic mentality leads to naturalizing forms that are by definition historical. Unable to imagine alternatives to the present situation, we adopt like a conformist attitude towards the ways of organizing ourselves socially. We believe that only those that exist in our everyday life are like truly possible. After analyzing the exclusionary criteria inherent to epistocracy, I would like to conclude by affirming that the deepening of democracy doesn't depend on an exclusive preference for election or sortition, but on the contextualized application of each of them according to the political challenge at hand. First of all, fetishism is located and produces in the capitalist market and becomes, shall we say, the dominant mode of intersubjective agency, insofar as agents are forced to engage in quantitative valuation of objects, to treat others instrumentally, and to perceive their talents and needs in terms of profitability. Since electoral processes in Western democracies involve a great deal of political marketing, setting up competitive contests between seemingly different options that are understood to satisfy the demands of the electorate, it can be invoked to address the question of representative regimes, even though these are usually theoretically grounded in non-economic consideration. It is often the case that, in one way or another, representative regimes end up establishing like an authorized political aristocracy for decision making. This political aristocracy is distinguished from the majority based on the supposed differences in knowledge between the two, and ultimately taken as the default model of political participation in a society. The most common justification for representative government uses the metaphor of a contract. The representative and the represented sign a symbolic agreement whereby the former undertakes to act on behalf of the latter, with the latter's consent. The repetition of elections and the various popular mobilizations that every democracy should welcome, ensure that the representative and the represented are in constant communication, thus confirming on a daily basis what is stipulated in the contract. In Capital, in Marx's Capital, we already find a critique of law in general and of the concept of contract in particular. At the beginning of the second chapter of the first volume, Marx states something like that. This legal relation, the form of which is the contract, whether legally developed or not, is a volitional relation in which the economic relation is reflected. The content of this legal or volitional relation is given by the economic relation itself. The relative autonomy of the contracting wheels during the contractual exchange, the debate on prices, forms of payment, wages, etc., it's a mere appearances that it is the contracting parties who move and dominate the mercantile circuit, when, I think, in reality, it is the circuit that moves them. Just as for the critique of political economy, it is a clear effect of fetishism to believe that the contract is what effectively organizes the economic sphere. For the critique of political fetishism that I want to examine here, it is clear that, conversely, it is the existence of an elective aristocracy determined to excel and who is convinced of the incapacity of the masses to govern that underlines the contractual model of representative democracies. In fact, electoral procedures have not always been interpreted as a demonstration of the lucidity of the agents. In ancient democracy, for example, they were understood as a means of distinguish certain subjects from the whole, and were therefore often limited by sortition for positions and responsibilities. This doesn't mean, however, that the spontaneity of an assembly, the assembly considered by many traditions to be the most refined and the most profound example of direct democracy, it's intrinsically superior. Following Foucault on this point, for example, one might think that the formal equality established by the assembly is obscured by differences in knowledge, prestige, or authenticity in political commitment, which determine who is more able to speak, to gain the confidence of his peers, or to defend the postulates in which he or she believes. In reality, the assembly is not sufficiently different from market regimes, for there too, the competition of equal subjects is transformed into domination by the unequal consequences, by the unequal resources with which each has access to the exchanges. Foucault's critique pointed to an undeniable fact. Economic, familiar, or symbolic resources establish invisible boundaries within supposedly equal spaces, so that democratic relations easily degenerate into aristocratic or, at worst, oligarchic environments. Thus, this is like my conclusion, direct participation alone does not prevent the competitive excesses that we have identified in representative democracy. So there are no models of political participation with absolutely pure characteristic or that correspond to essential principles. The only thing that can protect against the concentration of decision-making power in any of them is to recognize the relevance of the concept, the Aristotelian-inspired concept of hybridity. The idea that concrete regimes do not correspond to closed classifications, but rather turn out to be like a synthesis of different procedures of deliberation and decision-making. Democracy can have aristocratic institutions, just as aristocratic or oligarchic forms can have more or less extensive democratic spaces. That is why a democratic political theory should not act as if it were and aware of the empirical existence of difference in knowledge and virtuosity in the exercise of the various political functions, but rather by establishing rational criteria for their distribution should give the necessary space to the procedure, sortition, election, or many others that can be imagined, that are in each case most conducive to establishing egalitarian relations between citizens. That is, we have to study how to combine them in order to maximize the democratic horizon of a society. What constitutes an aristocratic risk, in my opinion, is the fetishistic attitude toward political forms, whether through the naive idea that the assembly gathers the collective feeling without any mediation, or through the elitist argument that the election automatically selects the most wise and capable and gives them a more optimal space for deliberation, because this space is matter. When we are affected by the mystification that characterizes political fetishism, we perceive the present in where we live uncritically, and the divisions established in the Western political field, like right, left, democratic, totalitarian, etc., appears to us as unquestionable realities. The election, understood almost as the political expression of the human state of nature, becomes a matter of struggle between voters, consumers, and candidates, producers. Although it is true that this ontological segmentation has undergone transformation through history. Bernard Manin, the French thinker, the French theorist, is now my point of reference. According to his classifications, 3 periods can be identified in which the election or the representative regime has played a prominent role. The first one, I don't know the expression in English, but something like the parliamentaries of dignitaries in the 19th century. Representative regimes were built around a few personalities chosen from groups of dignitaries and based on the exclusion of the working classes, who mobilized outside the parliaments. The second form, historical form, the party democracy, linked to the extension and the generalization of the mass parties. This phase is characterized by the popularization of the figure of the militant and the influence of the party apparatus, as well as the authority of the civil society in the public debates. And the third one, like our most known form, the electoral marketing. Today, the social importance of organization has diminished, and it is the leader who is constantly listening to the electoral sentiments of the voter, who often change their preference, while media opinion becomes relatively independent. Although they have obvious differences, I think all 3 periods coincide in proclaiming the sovereignty of the voter consumer, but the possibility of becoming a politically active agent is not really available to all. It is the group of dignitaries, the party oligarchies, or electoral marketing conglomerates that monopolize the instrument of public opinion production and end up becoming dominant. In all of these cases, there is an additional aristocratic compulsion inherent in the representative regime in which the party system is embedded. Voters must distinguish candidates on the basis of some motive, so they seek to produce such motive at all cost. Just as with the advent of capitalism, use values become mere pretext for the production of exchange values. In representative regimes, electoral motives are produced in order to secure the very core of the dynamics of the political field, the election and cultivation of political capital, and the possibility of entrenchment in the spheres of decision-making and power that this entails. Again, voting resembles, or election resembles, the expression of preference in a market, but as is typical of commodity fetishism, consumers do not have access to the structural nature of the production of the electoral offer, only to the outcome. However much we imagine ourselves to be rational agents, we rarely understand in all its complexity what we are voting for, nor what the candidates really embody, who, moreover, must correctly understand the cultural values of a society in order to be attractive to the electorate, etc. It's important, therefore, to talk about the epistemological demands of the electoral process, which again draws on Bernard Manan's work. First of all, voters or consumers should search for voting motives and identify the candidate who satisfies them. And again, candidates and producers must interpret the needs of the electorate, target them, and disseminate the information that they are the best possible choice. It is this demand that I think tend to shift the election towards a structurally oligarchic function. Although political marketing can theoretically develop in a fruitful way, that is, that voted with voters who understand well the reasons that lead them to prefer one candidate or another, and candidates who honestly pursue the reason for their political distinction and are rationally committed to their proposals, the reality is that competition is very likely to be transformed very quickly into an opportunity for the reconversion of capitals. This is as Bourdieu's terms. What this means, in my opinion, is that political capital is always acquired at the expense of other resources of an economic, epistemic, or networking nature. But precisely because of this, it is possible that the candidates who triumph do so for reasons that have nothing to do with good political judgment, but perhaps with who pays for the best election campaigns or ensures media presence, among other things. Political capital, hoarded with external help, confers power outside its field. It gives access to tasks that are intrinsically rewarding, allows the accumulation of knowledge necessary to perform them, provides resources that and recognition, and is used to exert influence in other social spheres through the same transformation of capitals that gave rise to it. Faced with the negative effects of the electoral process, we have traditionally known two responses, the technocratic one and one linked to the sortition. But I will talk about the first one. The first one, the technocratic response, comes from the anti-democratic liberal tradition in the form of what the Catalan philosopher Antoni Domènech called isonomic oligarchy, defined as follows. The idea of an isonomic oligarchy is that of a lower class which is not entirely deprived of civil freedom and equality, and therefore not enslaved, but which is deprived of political freedom and equality. In other words, it is the idea of a non-democratic or even anti-democratic freedom which aims at the political exclusion and civil subordination of those who live by their hands, the incorporation of all adult males into civil society, yes, but divided into two classes, that of the owners and that of the dispossessed, with only the former able to become politically active citizens and the latter having to be content with being politically passive citizens. In its various progressive or conservative configuration, this approach ultimately seeks to graduate access to the political sphere through, census suffrage. This is usually done by restricting participation to a certain level of income or other economic criterion, or by resorting to some form of epistocracy. In the latter case, political competence depends on good political judgment through education or profession, without it being clear what constitutes an indicator of good political judgment and how it is determined who possesses it. The idea of the select minority, both in Mill's educational version and Hayek's meritocratic version of the double chamber, for example, has been with the liberal tradition since its inception. In any case, the elitist component is not unique to liberalism. However much it is debated, the models that are presented as an antithesis, such as the Soviet or Chinese models, also have mechanisms for excluding majorities from decision-making processes. In any case, my point is that the criticism of the epistocratic paradigm, whether liberal or socialist, are inherent. On the one hand, political capital is clearly used to prevent competitors from competing by hindering their access to the political market. On the other hand, these procedures generate apathy and political ignorance, which the elites then use to justify technocracy, just as in neoliberal governance, for example, budget cuts to public services, which deliberately worsen their functioning, end up justifying their privatization. Finally, it is difficult to argue that a clique of any kind has the necessary knowledge to face any political challenge, and it is necessary to distinguish this epistocratic leaf, so to speak, from the technical specialization necessary to solve specific problems. No? So far, I have noted the link between Western representative regimes based on electoral market competition and the dynamics of political fetishization. It is worth insisting a little more on the latter, and wondering about the latent reason that explains the emergence of modern epistocracies. Maybe it is the scientist mentality of modernity, endowed with the idea that there is an order and a set of laws to be discovered, which generates the belief that it is possible to find like a model that provides definitive and valid political solutions for every situation. Behind the application of technocracy in all its forms lies the conviction that there is a perfect epistemological position that overcomes the bias of knowledge and renders the deliberation of the majority as useless. In this sense, it is no accident that in the ancient world, choice was largely subordinated to sortition, or at least severely restricted to certain activities. For the Greek imagination, human praxis was characterized by indeterminacy and unpredictability, and chaos. For example, Martha Nussbaum insists that the power of tragedy, far from reinforcing as a sense of providentialism, lay precisely in its warning against the dangers of seeking a single form. The tragic poem taught the irreducible richness of human value the complexity and indeterminacy of lived practical situations, etc. This leads us to think that Western thinking about democracy is incapable of standing on the idea that human deliberation is complex and not anchored in any promise of transcendence. The last thing I would like to argue as a logical consequence of all the above is that political fetishism can only be consolidated where there are no utopian horizons of the thinkable. That is, where the political imagination has been extinguished, and therefore what is thinkable in terms of political structures and social organization is identified exclusively with what exists. We all know Mark Fisher's thesis on the capitalist realism that has become so popular today, anchored in a like a post-political and ironic conception of the world. It is an ideological framework that believes itself to be emancipated from any kind of belief, but which, precisely for this false reason, prevents us from thinking of a convincing alternative to capitalism, leading to political exhaustion and sterility, colonizing every last corner of our unconscious and libidinal energies. And as far as the democratic question is concerned, this difficulty of our societies to go beyond the representative regime and the election as its default form might well have its origin in the epistemic security mechanism of modern scientists, as I have already mentioned, which is both based on the refined claim to have discovered the connecting principle of all phenomena of natural and social life, or in the liberal triumphalism that followed the fall of the Soviet Union, which gave rise to all sorts of apologists for the end of history. When technical calculations replace moral and political imagination, self-appointed epistemic elites emerge, concocting strategies of monopoly over politics that exclude the great majorities from decision-making spheres and prevent the effective democratization of social structures. It is, of course, worth clarifying what I mean, or what is meant by political imagination. I tend to support the Greek-French thinker Cornelius Castoriadis in affirming that imagination is not only linked to the representation or reflection of something, but properly to action, to invention, to creation of things and relations that are not given in perception, or that, in other words, have never been. The imaginary capacity presupposes the capacity to see in a thing what it is not, to see it as something that, and to see it as something other than what it is. For example, to quote Rimbaud, the poet Rimbaud, the invention of the unknown required new forms. I want to conclude that the list of historical experiences of putting the political imagination into practice is long, and I don't think it's necessary to elaborate further on this thesis, although our era seems to be characterized by an ongoing crisis of the political imagination. Precisely for this reason, I think that the consequences of not breaking with this political fetishism and its arbitrary enthronement of representative democracy are all too familiar to us. Citizen apathy, demobilization, etc., and other sensations that are nothing more than symptoms of a neglect of the function of citizenship. Exactly what we least need to face the situation of economic, ecological, and geopolitical crisis that has become the sign of our time. And that's all. Thank you very much for our patience.
Thank you very much for that talk. It's very interesting stuff. Do we have any questions from the audience? Okay. So I have a question if nobody else has one to go. Oh, Camila, you have one. Please, go ahead.
Thank you for a great presentation. I think you put the emphasis in the right places. I would like for you to talk a little bit more about the danger of epistocracy and how kind of like the idea of replacing elections with lottery and kind of like reproducing the same logic in which these are selected and the process itself. Because for me, at least working from the Global South and from also indigenous communities, we can think about sortition as a kind of a process, not as a specific procedure in a way, as the idea that we are all equal and therefore we can rule and be ruled in a way and sharing power, but not as a set of procedures that need to be there in order for that to be valid. This is very Western top-down approach, and you know, it is very disciplinary. Right, so we go back to kind of against the idea of, you know, constituent power, castoriatis, this kind of flow that comes and breaks through the crust of an ossified society. Kind of like, how can we like? What are your thoughts in this? And I'm going again, kind of embracing lottery as a kind of a very specific disciplinary thing, right? And what is happening today, and how do you see that we can actually not engage in that? Are there any things that we need to take into account, mechanisms, or whether you see in the literature that needs to be pushing us to kind of not be disciplinary in that manner?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. For me, for us, like the Greek example is an inspirational one. We do not like to reproduce like this disciplinary sortition procedure because it's useless in our very complex societies. But I think we have to find a way in which we can combine the necessary specialization of like the specialist, the technocrats in any way, people who knows how to do something, but I think we have to put them in democratic control of the majority of the population, For example, in our time of ecological crisis, it's obvious that scientists have to be like the avant-garde in the energetic transition. That's right. But for example, in Spain, we have now this public debate because a lot of territories are like being used to be energetic colonized to have like renewable energy like solar panels, etc. And there is a lot of people living there who are they're watching their territory being transformed in a sacrifice zone in order to go along with the necessary energetic transition that we all support. That's so the work of scientists has to be supervised in any way for the communities who live in the zones where this energetic transition has to be done. So I don't know what is the magic formula, but I agree with you totally in the sense that sortition has to be for us an inspiration, and that democracy has to ensure that knowledge has to be put in like for the common, not only for progress, or in this case for like for the ecological profit of the planet. I don't know if I answered your question more or less.
Yeah, I think the connection with the grassroots in a way, with the people and their territory in a way, and not kind of a abstraction and
yeah,
technification of it in a way. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Camila. Do we have any further questions? All right. So I want to ask a little bit more about political fetishism, and the idea that you need a sort of utopian horizon of thought of political possibility to kind of defeat that fetishism. How do you see that working? Why can't the two things kind of coexist, where people have a utopian horizon, but they have a kind of backwards, politically fetishistic view of how one might get there?
Well, I think that's the most difficult question to answer, of course, but well, in my opinion, at least in Europe or in the global north, I think we have to think. I believe that we have to think that there is an objective limit to the Keynesian economical politics and the the welfare state discourse, because that model, for me, or as I see the situation, has demonstrated completely unable to face the actual, I don't know, problems we have to face in the first case, the ecological one, but also the uprising of the far left, sorry, the far right, because lots of countries where social democracy were like the governing force now are being absolutely I don't know. Yeah, the right wing parties are having an power because, like, the welfare state narrative, I think now for most people didn't work and isn't working nowadays. So I don't know how we can reconnect with this utopian horizon or this utopian imagination, but I think we have to in a political sense, we have to tell the truth and recognize which limits in the political gestion, of the capitalist state we have to change, to modify in any way.
Great. Thanks for that answer. Do we have any final one? We've got time for one more follow-up question before we take another short break before Suryamayi's talk. All right. Well, thank you again, Violeta, for that very interesting talk. And yeah, halfway through the speakers now. This is going as well as I had hoped. So we will take a 5-minute break and go have a glass of water or whatever, refresh ourselves, and then we'll come back in 5 minutes for Suryamayi Aswini Clarence-Smith to talk about prefigurative politics and the experience of the Oroville Citizens Assembly pilot. So we'll see you all very shortly. All right, so we'll just give everybody a minute. Oh, what the fuck?
That was weird.
Yeah.
You want to hang out with me after?
Okay, sorry about that. All right, let's get started. So our next speaker is Suryamayi Aswini Clarence-Smith, who is at the University of the California Institute of Integral Studies, presenting on Citizens Assembly pilot in Oroville, which is an intentional community in India, and the experience of that as prefigurative politics. Suryamayi, the stage is all yours.
Thanks, Oliver. Yeah, so just a brief introduction to myself, mainly just that I'm both an academic researcher and an activist. And that makes me really happy to be presenting in this forum that connects activists and academics around the topic of sortition. And it was really great hearing Camila's talk and how she also, embraces both of those roles. So it's great to see it happening in action in this conference. So I'm not originally, let's say, a scholar of sortition. My research focus is on prefigurative and utopian practice. So there's also some links there with the discussion around utopianism at the end of Violeta's talk. So much of actually my research on utopianism, utopian practice, prefigurative practice has been carried out in Oroville, which is the largest intentional community in the world, based in India. And a significant focus of this has actually been on its governance and its political practice. So that's where the connection to sortition will come in. So I'm actually also a member of the Oroville community. My research has gone hand in hand with my activism, or let's say active citizenship in Oroville. So I've actually been involved in the governance of the community in various capacities. I've been a member of the basically the municipal budgeting committee, youth housing committee, and organizing basically large community-based decision-making processes, including this pilot citizens assembly, which I'm going to present. So basically, the subject of my talk today is this pilot citizens assembly that took place in this really unique context of an intentional community, which is actually Oroville is the largest intentional community in the world and amongst the oldest. It has a socialist form of political and economic organization, which makes it another good case study for this forum. I recently published a paper on this case study in the journal New Political Science with a co-author who is also an anthropologist and a member of Oroville. And not to give away the punchline of my talk, but I think this is actually really a particularly interesting case study for this form of sortition advocates, because citizens' assemblies and other similar democratic processes that are based on random selection of participants are usually used to enhance the political participation or consultation of citizens in representative democracies. Whereas here we have an example that demonstrates how it can also be a good tool to paradoxically improve participation in direct democracies. And secondarily, also how bringing people together around topics of common societal concern can be a space to prefigure key societal ideals, even utopian ideals that we might hold for a society, which could be along socialist lines or otherwise. So I'm going to start by presenting basically the unique societal context that is Oroville, and then I'm going to delve into why and how the Citizens Assembly pilot came about in that community, and focus really on what impact it had on the political culture of Oroville, which I think is relevant for other activist contexts that have been practicing direct democracy and that have so far really eschewed, sortition, basically limiting participation in any kind of way, but are coming up against a lot of issues around equitable participation. So let me start by introducing Orville. So as I mentioned, Orville is the largest, by far the largest, and amongst the oldest of intentional communities in the world today. So it has a population of over 3,300 residents, which is highly culturally diverse. There's over 60 nationalities. And now 3,300 might seem like a small number, you know, kind of like a village, village size. But actually for an intentional community, it is really large. The second largest intentional community in the world, Damanhur in Italy, is only half the size, or actually less than half the size of this. So for those who aren't familiar with intentional communities, they are essentially communities that have been founded, I mean, it's in the name, with certain key intentions, shared values, intentions. They're usually residential communities in the sense that people actually live together. They can take various forms. They can be based, let's say, just on ecological, values. So for example, eco-villages. They can be co-housing, where people, for example, with different sexual orientations decide to live together. There can be just a really, really wide range of ways in which people choose to live together, and how much they actually share in terms of resources, and also how autonomous they are. So Orville is really on the end of that spectrum, in the sense that it is close to what we would call an institutionally complete, let's say, alternative society, in the sense that it has its own land base, it has its own political institutions, it has its own schools, its own health centers, it has its own businesses, it shares its economy, in the sense that there is no private property, so there's shared ownership basically of all of the social enterprises that finance the community. So it is really a pretty fascinating attempt at prefiguring an alternative society at a micro scale, and has achieved a large amount of autonomy in that regard. So I'm going to focus now on basically really the political organization and practice of the Orville community, rather than some of the other different aspects. But if people are interested in that, you can ask me, of course, in the question and answer. So essentially, the political ideals of Orville from the beginning have been to have a basically enlightened, not enlightened elite, but enlightened citizenry, so that essentially everybody in the community would be educating themselves about the topics that are of concern of the community, and educating themselves to be basically a positive force, a positive impact on the collective. So it seems quite natural that it has embraced basically collective forms of decision-making, non-hierarchical forms of decision-making, a lot of horizontal feminist modes of decision-making from the beginning. Small caveat here, especially if there are people in the audience who are aware of Orville and current developments. This has shifted in recent years. Again, I won't delve into this now, but with the current Indian government, which is a highly nationalist, religious nationalist government, there has been an attempted takeover of the political autonomy decision-making of the community. So right now we are experiencing a lot of enforced top-down hierarchical use of power. But in terms of the community's own internal practice, it has always been horizontal forms of decision-making. So we see a lot of what Camila discussed in her talk around kind of not just sortition, but rotation. So just like, large prefigurative social movements like Occupy, you have a model of basically general assemblies in which anybody who is a part of the community, in this case, is invited to participate in decisions that are brought forth to the community. Anybody can propose a topic that should be brought forth to the community for a decision, but you need currently a minimum of 60 people in order for the decision to be brought forth to a process. So you need to have at least some sort of collective notion that it is of import. And while the community in its early years, when it was smaller, used these general kind of meetings, basically general assemblies, to decide on all topics, of course, over time, as the community developed, grew, became more complex, became larger, there was a decision to delegate decision-making, let's say delegate or responsibility, it would be a better word, for different areas of governance of the community. For example, there have been committees that have been created in order to deal with the finance and assets of the community, committees to deal with interacting, for example, with Indian government officials, so to represent the community in that regard, committees to look into town development. So there, and one of the ways in which we can see that it remains sort of highly participatory and not concentrated power is that there are what a lot of members of Orville consider to be actually a ridiculous number of committees. There are many committees, many more than we would imagine might be necessary to self-govern 3,300 people. But this, in a sense, democratizes power. And I think Camila discussed this in her talk as well. Basically allows for the opportunity for a lot of people to educate themselves in terms of what does it mean to actually participate in governing my community. So it becomes a learning space to have this large number of committees that are present. So that is essentially how the community internally governs itself. What is very interesting is that the community actually obtained through an act of parliament in India a form of or a degree of autonomy to basically carry out all of this internal decision making. So the Act of Parliament recognizes the three authorities of the Orville Foundation. One of them is the Residents' Assembly, which is every member of the community above 18, and which is responsible for internal decision making and the internal development of the community. It also has created two other bodies, governing bodies. One of them is the governing board, consisting of Indian people who are considered to have knowledge relevant to a project like Orville, and who meet in Orville only twice a year. They're not Orwellian. They meet only twice a year, and they're essentially briefed on the development of the community. Their responsibility, according to the Foundation Act, is to oversee the development of Orville according to its ideals, to the ideals set out by the community initially, or for the community initially. And the third body is an international advisory council, composed, in the name you see it, of actually people from all over the world, not just Indian. And their role is sort of to oversee the governing board and the relationship between the governing board and the Residents' Assembly, so that there is a kind of checks and balance there, so that we don't end up in a situation where the governing board takes on hierarchical power that is able to really kind of impose and override the Residents' Assembly process, which regrettably is what we are seeing today in the current with the current far-right government and the governing board that they have elected or selected. So the context in which the pilot Citizens' Assembly came about is essentially one in which the community, or it was felt within the community, that this highly direct democratic participatory mode of decision-making was actually coming up against, paradoxically, issues of equitable participation, which are issues that we see, I mentioned Occupy, which are issues that we see in prefigurative social movements that have used these same forms of direct democratic forms of self-governance, which essentially are that there is a high investment in time required for people to participate, and not everybody has that time. people who are more comfortable speaking in public settings, who have a better command of the English language. As I mentioned, this is a highly international community, with including about 50% of the community is Indian, and some of them from the local neighboring villages, for whom English is not a first language. But for a lot of the rest of the international members of the community, English is not a first language either. So language becomes an issue, a barrier to basically equitable participation in these contexts. And dynamics, essentially, that are, an extreme word might be toxic. Let's say spaces that are not facilitated, in which sort of civil ways of, sharing time, listening respectfully, responding respectfully, are not well upheld, which makes some people simply refuse to engage because it is overwhelming or intimidating. So in this context, it was felt that actually trialing a citizens' assembly, so piloting a citizens' assembly, might be an interesting, let's say, antidote to some of these issues. Because you could have a facilitated process, a highly facilitated process. You could have educational sessions on the topic at hand, because one of the barriers to participation that I did not mention is also people feeling that they're not educated enough about the topic to come and share their opinion about it in a general meeting and basically try to influence others about that, about their points. Where was I? Yeah, so the educational aspect, the issues with the participation in time and participation in language, and it was felt that the CA could address, the pilot could address all of those. Another really key aspect, which is interesting for this context, is around the random selection, because another thing that was felt is that even though these general assemblies were open to all, it ended up often being the same people who would speak up, who would, in a sense, dominate. So there would be sort of hidden hierarchies of power that would manifest themselves in these supposedly horizontal, or let's say on the surface, or in protocol, horizontal contexts. So it was felt that random selection would actually might be a tool to bring into the conversation people that didn't typically participate, that didn't typically maybe even think to participate, and sort of really diversify the people who participated in these processes. And coming back to a point that Camila made in her talk, really around this idea of basically, and forgive me if I get this wrong, Camila, around essentially the social desire for political participation. So what would it be to create a sort of safe, interesting, accessible, supportive space in which people could come and basically have an experience of what it means to participate in collective decision making? Because to give you a bit of an idea, at the time that this CA pilot was being envisioned, so this is 2019, a few years back, the average participation of people in a General Assembly decision, a final decision, was about 200, so which is less than 10% of the population, since it's now 3,300, including about 600 minors. So this is the context in which the CA pilot came about. And one of the interesting things, again, around sortition is, so we, the team that set up the CA pilot, of which I was a part, didn't just come with sort of a cookie cutter model of a citizens' assembly, not that there is really such a thing, but came to the community in a consultative process and asked them, which aspects of a kind of CA do resonate with you. We asked specific questions, for example, around whether the community would like us to use random or stratified selection, around the age of the participants, whether we should consider including participants that were younger than the age of 18, which was the norm. And interestingly for this forum, since with its focus on sortition, is that while we fully expected the community to ask for stratified random selection, meaning that there would be a certain quota of people, let's say 20%, could be different nationalities, 20, for example, or 50% women, or maybe even a larger percentage of Indians, sort of representative of the demographic of Indian citizens that are members of Orville. So we were absolutely expecting stratified random selection to be opted for, but the community chose to go for complete random selection. The idea being that they actually felt like rather than addressing some kind of what might be a perceived discrimination by saying, okay, let's make sure that we include 50% women or the Indian community, that actually it would further cement those senses of discrimination rather than just really allow for complete random selection and to see what would happen with that. Particularly members of the Tamil community, which is the local, the state of Tamil Nadu in which Orville is based, really insisted that there should be no stratified random selection. That meant that we had to do a lot of work as a team, basically to encourage those demographics that are less represented typically in general assemblies, for example, Tamil women, to come and participate. And so what we did is we did a process by which we actually went and met with all of the people who were randomly selected. This took a lot of human resources, and explained to them the process, reassured them that any issues that they might have with participation would be addressed, for example, childcare or providing of language translation so that people would be able to speak in their language if they felt more comfortable doing that. So we ended up running the pilot in 2020, 2021. And the topic was also chosen by consultation with the community. It ended up being on developing a water vision for Orville, which was a very complex topic, as you can imagine, due to the environmental issues at hand, the political issues with sharing the watersheds with other constituencies, other municipalities other than Orville, and with we have a lot of water experts in the Orville community that have differing views on how to bring those views together in the face of a crisis situation, as the water table is lowering in that area, and of course in a lot of coastal tropical areas around the world, which are very vulnerable to climate change. So the topic was decided through this consultative process with the community. The, let's say, criteria of the CA were also decided in consultation with the community. We ended up including teenagers 16 and above in the process. So that was the first time that minors were actually included in the process. And amongst the key aspects that we wanted to bring into the CA process, other than just education on the topic, was really to use the CA pilot in order to create or let's say, launch the spark of a shift in the overall political culture of Orville. So basically, we included a lot of skill building, which is included in a large amount of citizen assemblies, for example, around identifying bias that people might have, developing skills for listening, and facilitation in order to bring sort of views together in a way that was participatory, that enabled people to hear each other's views, and also that didn't look for 100% consensus in the same way that is done in these large general assemblies, in which ends up taking a lot of time and actually invisibly ends up not really being 100% consensus, because a lot of people are excluded from simply participating in the process in the first place, not because of how the process is designed, but because of how the process ends up going, and how entitled people feel or to participate, or how comfortable that they feel in terms of participating. So the outcomes were that actually the participants really highly valued the skill building, so the capacity building component, the educational aspect, and the random selection aspect. So where another piece in which this links with prefigurative politics, so prefigurative politics is a term that is often used sort of intertwined or overlapping with direct democracy. But I think that actually we need to a little bit break that that overlap, because to prefigure simply means to, in the present, sort of try to enact the modes of functioning, the attitudes, the relationships that we want to see in the future. So while it's sort of become really enmeshed with this idea of, for sure in terms of prefigurative politics with direct democracy, I think it's a question that we need to really consider, that prefiguration is not owned, as a concept by direct democracy, and it can be looked at and enacted in various political contexts, including all the way to the far right, potentially, theoretically speaking, for sure. So we also wanted the Citizens' Assembly to be a space in which key societal ideals of Orwell could be prefigured through and within the decision-making process. Because another reason why people were not interested in participating in these large general assemblies is that, as I mentioned, some of the interpersonal dynamics were heated, divisive, conflictive, while Orwell is a community that aspires to be one that upholds human unity. So human unity in diversity, not a form of uniformity that we might see in other intentional communities or in utopian projects, where it is assumed that there is one way of doing things and everyone needs to ascribe to that way. So Orwell is definitely not a so-called utopia along those lines. It is very much a heterotopia, or utopia that is predicates itself on experimentation, and on bringing together really this diversity of people through mutual agreement, through a mutual process of listening, of being, of acting, of enacting together, and building community through that. So through and with and enclosing difference. So given that the political culture was not at all reflecting this ideal of human unity, it was one of the spaces that a lot of Orwellians felt, I don't know if embarrassed is the right word, but almost definitely disappointed, almost embarrassed, by saying, like, how is this representative of who we are as a community? How is this enactment of politics representative of who we are? So how could we, in the context of the CA pilot, actually prefigure or facilitate the prefiguration of human unity, which was one of the core ideals of the community. And another one was unending education. So the unending education piece is pretty clear. The CA model, as the Citizen Assembly model, as I'm sure most of you here, if not all of you here, know, is of course based on having a large number of stakeholders, be they experts or otherwise, or stakeholders in a different capacity, present their perspectives to a randomly selected group of participants, and allow those participants to hear those diverse views, to educate themselves on those diverse views, and then to sort of harmonize them around often a policy decision or a yes or no decision. And as we've seen in the example, for example, of the Citizens' Assembly in Ireland on abortion, attitudes, beliefs, preconceptions can be changed on highly intense topics with deeply entrenched views. So the CA model, by virtue of having this educational component, in and of itself facilitates Orwell's idea of unending education. And this is something that Camila also brought up in her talk, is the idea that we are constantly learning. And when we participate in decision-making on different topics, now I think she was discussing this in the context of expertise, and of the sort of idea of who is the expert and who gets to be an expert and who gets to have a say in decision-making because they are experts. And countering that and saying, well, actually, if we have processes in which we each get a chance to educate ourselves on the topic, then we actually become the experts. And sometimes we might become more expert than the experts, because the experts are sometimes stuck in silos on their own expertise. Whereas as a randomly selected participant in the Citizens Assembly, we have the luxury of hearing a wide variety of perspectives, potentially without having a stake in any of those particular views. The skill building component was another key aspect of how the CA prefigured this idea of unending education. So really to actually also build skills, learn and build skills in decision making and for decision making. And around human unity, this sought to be prefigured, as I mentioned, not in the way that it had sort of theoretically been in these sort of large general assemblies in Orwell and in other large social movements, which is essentially through typically 100% or a very high majority percentage of consensus around a particular decision or view to be made politically. But rather, we took the opportunity to build community in various ways, not just around the decision making itself, but in terms of allowing participants to get to know each other, to listen to each other in pairs, in small groups on the issues, so to basically build rapport, build understanding. It overlapped with the skill building around bias, so understand where there were biases that might be at play, and to hopefully try to unravel those biases, which again might be even stronger in a small community like Orwell, or certainly actually even stronger in a small community like Orwell, where there are lots of personal histories that are intertwined, rather than in much more apersonal settings like Occupy or other social movements, where the actors might not know themselves as well. So it ended up being a space in which these societal ideals could be prefigured as well, which again is potentially, we could imagine is potentially most significant at these smaller local scales, which is one of the things that we really brought forth, myself and my co-author Leslie, in our paper rather than actually in the pilot, was to reconsider in light of the fact that citizens' assemblies, the outcomes of citizens' assemblies are often disregarded by those with political power. Camila spoke to this as well. How can we actually, does it make sense to reconsider citizen assemblies at local municipal scales, or not just citizens' assemblies, but other forms of processes based on sortition? Because what we've seen so far is a lot of CAs at large national scales, which end up then having their outcomes potentially disregarded. But as Camila mentioned in her talk, and this is something that we really saw in the CA pilot in Orwell, when you do this at local and potentially even regional scales, it builds a lot more power, people power on the ground, a lot more networks actually that can then be built, be strategically pulled upon in order to bring outcomes forward. So definitely agree with Camila on the idea that the focus on kind of local, regional levels, and the focus on actually the education, let's say, of a social desire for political participation is perhaps what is the most significant contribution of these kinds of processes right now in the context of large representative democracies, in which actually unfortunately the outcomes of these processes are less likely, the political outcomes are less likely to be significant. All the more so in the far right governments that we are seeing present today, in the autocratic governments that we are seeing present today. I see that I am close to the end of my time. So I might end there, except for one other point, that just to say that the Citizens' Assembly in Orwell, so even in this local context of a community in which there was a consultative process. We wanted this pilot. We wanted to see its outcomes implemented. Even there was a lack of implementation of the outcomes. So that's interesting to see that there's the same issues are faced there too. And this was really an issue, not just of power, let's say these working groups not being willing to implement the outcomes, but just of sheer human resources required to do so. So one of the things that we noted is that something that could be done in these kind of local contexts, and that was done in the Orville context, is that essentially a group of participants, organizers, basically committed to seeing the outcomes implemented. So essentially in other contexts, we could imagine sort of a small maybe NGO being formed or other forms that could help to kind of lobby and bring these outcomes forward on local scales. So I think I will pause there so we can have the proper time for questions and answers and take it forward there. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you. That fascinating talk on a very, very interesting project. Our first question is in the chat from Terry Mauritius. He says, you said in design work in consultation with the community several times. How was this conducted? Did this over-rely on current community leaders? I recognize the difficulty of building the airplane while it's flying. How might this be done in the future once the system is more institutionalized?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this was a pilot, and it's not that we decided to start by saying, okay, we are going to go through an official residence assembly process and get this endorsed formally by the community and run it that way. We really ran it as an experiment. So we started off in a very, very grassroots way by basically consulting a few people that we thought might be interested, sort of kind of like diverse bodies, diverse sort of profiles of community members. That's actually how I became involved. I wasn't part of the original team. It was through one of these consultative processes. And I was doing my PhD on time on Orville's governance. And I thought, wow, this pilot is really responding to so many of the key issues that is coming up in my research. I want to be a part of this. So we started out that way. And then we kind of built up to a community meeting. So it wasn't an official decision-making meeting, but it was a general meeting in which the whole community was called forth. So we did have a general meeting in which we got that feedback that I mentioned around sort of criteria of participation and all of that. And then we did consult with the working groups, so with the working groups of the community as well, particularly once the topic was defined. The topic was on, as I mentioned, was on developing a water vision for the community. So we were sure to consult with the Town Development Council, just because they were going to be the group that would be in charge of implementing. So to make sure that we had, buy-in isn't the right word, but just a really an understanding from them, that they would understand that the process, what process these people would be going through, and what were the outcomes that they were going to present, what process had actually come through that. At the end of the process, we also presented the outcomes. So we did an evaluation as well for the purposes of the community, some of which we used in the academic paper. But that evaluation, basically that evaluated how participants saw it, we also brought to the working groups. So not just the Town Development Council, but also other working groups, for example, the ones that represent Orville before the Indian officials, to kind of discuss this process and whether they thought that it was viable, basically presented to them, discuss whether this is a tool that we might want to use. So there were many layered forms of intervention and consultation that happened prior as well as after, to basically really educate along with us as we were experimenting and piloting this process. I hope that answers your question.
Awesome. We got a further question from Rich Brown in the chat. Have other citizens' assemblies evolved from the pilot?
Yes, thank you. I was running out of time and trying to decide whether to get into that. So interestingly, so one of the things that or let me take a step back. The main purpose of the pilot was to see whether the CA process essentially could be something that could empower a shift in the political culture of the oral community. And there again, I come back to what Camila and Violeta were discussing earlier around the kind of idea of protocol. I'm not using the exact right words, but protocol versus process. So what it actually kind of like what a CA is supposed to look like, but actually what is the process that is being cultivated. So while the Citizens Assembly as a model hasn't been used again in the exact way that we used it, a lot of different elements have been used in community decision-making processes since. And I don't know if this is something that was particularly enabled by the fact that it is a small community and we did a lot of this kind of education around what were the different aspects of it. So I do have a question around scale here and whether we would see such a proliferation of similar practices if it was being done, at larger levels, regional, national levels, but definitely in the small context of Orville, it did create a real impact in terms of, Violeta discussed earlier, the imaginary, right? The political imaginary of how could we actually do politics. So it definitely opened ideas and possibilities around that, and random selection was used in a participatory budgeting process, other forms of kind of bringing in various stakeholders and creating educational aspects as part of a collective decision-making process was used around a very divisive topic around town planning. So, and there were very direct links between the Citizens Assembly experience and then bringing in these elements into the decision-making culture of Orville. So in that sense, the pilot was definitely successful in terms of opening up, as Violeta discussed, the imaginary and picking out things that actually shifted the process and the culture rather than just picking out a protocol.
Great. We have a question from Camila. Should probably have to be the last question, given that it's
so. First of all, fascinating and really great job. I am so happy because of this pilot and all what you have related. I have first a comment. We had some similar experiences you were relating with the kind of interpersonal relations in the assemblies, and they're kind of like how patriarchy and misogyny and hierarchy basically just sip into the assembly, and it's very difficult to kind of create not a safe space, because this is just kind of such a loaded word, but basically a space in which we can be equal in a way. And some of the things that I learn a lot from American union activity on procedures of equality, and sometimes they're taking too far, but there are things that they, at least my kind of consultancy that I did for the assemblies and all the talks that I gave, people started using this, and the same with the idea of sortition and direct democracy. It was really being implemented, and one of the things that was really resonating with people was to do what Bernie Sanders does for his press conferences, the progressive stack. That when everybody's gonna speak, basically, the moderator just chooses first the person that has never spoken or spoken, and there's this idea rule in a way in the space in which you need to understand that if you speak too much, then you're not going to be able to speak. So you need to be able to kind of measure yourself, because you need to understand that time is a short supply, right? So, and how basically you can do the zebra approach we did in Chile, when one woman, always start with a woman or start with someone in a minority position, and then do a male and not to leave them behind, but to kind of like mix it up in a way. And this, I think, those rules that are minimal liberate you, because then it is not up to the moderator, it's not up to the specific group. It is just a way of doing things, and you cannot be as rigid as to impose 2 minutes and then you cannot express yourself. People are they have different timings, so we need to really be open in how to kind of a pilot like this could be applied. I don't know your thoughts on that first, and how you can adapt kind of the process into other settings in a way, or kind of bring it, replicate it. And the second is just a direct question on what are the activities that you did first outside of the deliberation? Because for me, coming from the Global South and coming from a kind of community organizing background, kind of, it is very difficult to separate, food from deliberation in a way, and other forms of social activity. And I think we Westerners, separate, we do the deliberation, it's like business, and there's no space for actual gathering. So what other activities did you share? Food, very practical of this, this, how many hours were together, some more kind of practical specificities about the process you can tell us.
Yeah. First of all, yeah, it's so funny that you bring up the example of time and facilitators, because it's always such a trap of saying, everybody has 2 minutes and then everybody's frustrated and the moderator gets shot, and it's just like a really just so awful situation. So I absolutely agree with you that having these kinds of rules that are not time-based but can liberate the moderator as well. It's a very, very tough job for moderators for facilitators to facilitate these general assemblies, particularly with heated dynamics. I have to say I have a lot of respect for the people who are ready to attempt to do those. So what we did in the Citizens Assembly around that is we ended up favoring a lot of small group discussions, and this was largely because of the feedback that we got from people who said that one of the main reasons why they were not coming to the general assemblies is because they were absolutely terrified of speaking in front of 200 people and sharing their views in front of 200 people. So we ended up doing a lot of facilitated small group discussions, and then sort of gathering the outcomes of that small group, the kind of consensus that was built in that small group, together with other small groups, and having them present back, and each group sort of decided who would present back. So we sort of built up the kind of consensus that way, which felt a lot more easier, a lot more accessible for a lot of participants. So that's how we dealt with that. We actually shifted completely away from this general assembly model, which was really intimidating. And then in terms of the activities that went with the deliberation, so Orville is a community that also embraces a spiritual culture and a spiritual practice. So we had a lot of sort of moments of silence, of meditation, of contemplation, which sort of really also helped to set the tone for kind of discussions that might come later, and kind of set not the tone, but the sort of the atmosphere, let's say. And we, one of the things that we really brought forth, so these are already used somewhat in decision-making processes, definitely not in the general assemblies, but in smaller ones they were used. And what we brought that was kind of new was really around this sort of idea of prefiguring human unity, was a lot of actually playful activities in which people might get to know each other and to interact with each other in different ways. So to give you a practical example, you were asking for practical examples. For example, one of the sort of energizers that we did in the midst of, these sort of deliberations, discussions, it was on water. It was, we played some music and we said, pretend that you're doing your favorite water sport. It could be like skiing, it could be swimming. So just like very just playful ways. And it was really charming actually to see, some people that would never, have the opportunity to kind of interact with each other in that sort of playful way, that might, you were speaking about sort of patriarchal attitudes and all that. So to see that kind of really play out in that way was really lovely. And it was actually really successful in building relationship and kind of breaking down sort of barriers of perception of how we perceive others, especially in a small community.
Fantastic. So the next speaker doesn't appear to be here just yet. So we have time for a couple more questions. Were there any further questions?
Can I follow up very, very fast? Sorry for
Sure.
all the time. Did you have, because part of the assembly experience and consensus building is to be exposed to the same kind of facts in a way, or
Yes.
same kind of information. So how did that play out? Because of course you can want to have whatever water organization, But if you have no knowledge of your, what is possible in terms of technical possibilities, how much that does it cost, what are going to be the pros and cons, you need multiple, information. So did you put pedagogical kind of or testimonial moments? I know that in the French Convention for the Climate, they did this. Basically, they had like the assembly was more for like pedagogical ways, and basically everybody goes in and learns something that it must be maybe not kind of complete authority, because you're going to see another testimony from another side or another technical opinion or whatever, but everybody exposes to the same. So how many of these activities did you have them? How many? What's the effect on then the consensus building?
Yeah. So let me take half a step back in terms of how we chose the topic. So there was a community survey basically that was circulated around what people thought was a really important topic of common concern that we should address. We came up with 3 topics that were, that people considered to be highly important. Water was one of those 3. How we narrowed down on water is that we knew that we had a lot of expertise in the community around water. So we actually already had the knowledge ready to share with participants, whereas other topics, there was, for example, topics around whatever assets management, but we didn't actually have the data around how many assets were used or the efficiency to which they were used. So we would have had to first generate that knowledge in order to be able to pass it on. So one of the reasons we chose water out of the top 3 priorities is that we had a knowledge base ready to share. Now, in terms of how the process was organized, we had the first couple of sessions which were dedicated to sort of bias and listening, this building relationships with one another, building an understanding of the process. Then we had 6 what we called evidence sessions, where people were presented with knowledge from various experts. So experts came in and gave the talk. So in that case, it was a plenary. So everyone was getting the same information, opportunities for question and answers. We had panels with the various experts. So this was all over 6 days. And then the last 2 days were dedicated to basically kind of informing a water vision for the community based on what they had heard. And sorry, just to add one more thing on that is we also selected somebody who we trusted to basically be the kind of coordinator of the experts, so to actually help select the experts. So somebody who knew what were all the various perspectives that were being held around water, who held those perspectives, and to ensure that the experts were selected so that each of these perspectives were represented. Obviously, we didn't use random selection for the expertise because then you might have gaps. So there we used someone who was really knowledgeable about this area without themselves being an expert holding a view that they were wanting to see implemented. They weren't themselves a practicing water expert in the community.
All right. Thanks so much for that fantastic talk. It's a really, really interesting case study, and some really interesting stuff coming out of that. So our next talk is we're going to have a brief break, and then we will have Thomas Kirkland. And Thomas, am I right in understanding that you'll be presenting on the topic that Christiana would have been?
That's correct. I'll be filling in for her. So I'm just reading a paper that she's prepared. She regrets to be unable to attend this evening.
All right. And so are you going to want to do the Q&A after that as well, or should we move after that straight to the panel discussion?
You should go directly to the panel discussion. To the best of my ability, I can try to answer any questions, but I think that it might be better to forward the Q&A. Yeah.
Okay. Well, in that case, we can stay on schedule then. Fantastic. Okay. So let's take a 2-minute break, and then we'll come back, and Thomas will be hearing you talk on from grand course platforms to embedded constituent power.
Yes.
So awesome. See you all in a couple of minutes. All right. Okay. We ready to go, Thomas?
I'm ready to go. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. So, would you like to introduce yourself and your organization very briefly?
Well, perhaps you could give the introduction that you've prepared for Christiana. I'm simply reading for her this evening.
All right. So Christiana Mauro, who wrote the talk we'll be hearing this afternoon, is a senior advisor at the Biosphere Institute. And the talk is, very briefly, from Grand Court's platforms to embedded constituent power, about the potential of different kinds of sortitional institutions, as I understand it. Yeah, Thomas, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Oliver. I should just mention that Christiana is a legal advocate by profession. She has a special interest in civic education, and she's specialized in, she has degrees in comparative constitutional law with a specialization in the law of the European Union, which is quite germane to what we will be talking about. The title, again, is From Grand Cause Platforms to Embedded Constituent Power. The principle of participatory democracy is these days perceived from a standpoint of well-founded cynicism. We're going to consider some possibilities for modernizing the political concept of constituent power using Hannah Arendt's forward-thinking model of constitutionalism. That is the institutionalization of constituent power. Citizens' assemblies, which are reshaping policy-making approaches in some jurisdictions, are giving meaningful expression to this concept. And the unique constitutional architecture of the European Union, we would argue, could serve as an ideal experiment in modernizing failing democratic structures. The use of sortition methodologies and the growing support for participatory deliberation processes suggests that the idea of institutionalized citizens' assemblies is worth attention, as robust legal mechanisms for citizen input are necessary to fulfill the substantive core tenets of legitimate governance. The organization of citizens' assemblies, or deliberative groups composed of a stratified random sampling of citizens for a discrete period, is becoming increasingly popular. Successful practices of public participation, which are reshaping policy making in some parts of the world, are giving meaningful expression to the principle of constituent power. This includes the creation of an observatory of citizens chosen by lot, deliberating on Madrid City Council policy proposals, a permanent citizens' council in a Belgian community, assemblies deliberating on electoral reform in Canada, Toronto standing citizens advisory panels, and embedded deliberative citizens panels in Victoria, Australia. A governance mechanism of this kind would face quite different operational challenges at the transnational level. But from a constitutional point of view, it appears to be politically feasible. It's conceivable that such practices could be embedded institutionally into the EU polity and provide a remedy for its failures in fulfilling the substantive core tenets of legitimate decision-making. In this talk, we aim to identify the potential for the institutionalization of citizens' assemblies and hopefully will encourage relevant European legislation initiatives. We will also consider how the model of a citizens' assembly could be embedded into the EU, and we'll present some of the legal argumentation of the European Court of Justice, which has strongly supported the institutionalization of people's power. The institutional arrangements of the EU are considered by political and legal scholars to be largely the result of contributions from the European Court's case law. Each successive injection of democracy into the framework by the court has strengthened the power of citizens. The court itself has indicated that, quote, a strengthened parliament may not be sufficient, unquote. And some legal scholars would even argue that the court has a constitutional mandate to confer power to bodies and agencies. An analysis of the legal reasoning of the court can offer a working framework for analysis which has broader relevance. This would contribute to the social and academic debates about citizen participation and to the legal scholarship on the functional capacity of law. The sociologist Jeffrey Alexander has argued that, quote, to the degree society is democratic, law is an institution of civil regulation, unquote. The notion that constituents' ability to monitor institutional overreach may be even more essential than legal and constitutional provisions has been influential since the French Revolution. And the mechanisms intended to stem the problems associated with power holders and to address public perceptions of disempowerment are a pressing contemporary matter. But without institutional guarantees, the fundamental function of civil society as either an anchor, according to Habermas, or a regulator, according to Karl Popper, of authoritative bodies is being diluted and appropriated either through structural suppression with shrinking civil society spaces, privatized consultations, and lobbying secrecy, or operatively through political storytelling and well-developed opinion management tactics. We think that countering these effective neoliberal strategies entails, among other things, a modernization of the political concept of constituent power. In the EU context, such a reinterpretation would require a modification of the constitutional architecture and could take the form of the establishment of a citizens' chamber of parliament. The public perception of the decision-making process as contaminated by special interests is both justified and unremitting. The idea that the citizens' capacity to monitor institutional corruption may be even more essential than constitutional provisions has been influential as well since the French Revolution. But suitable legal mechanisms are always required to enshrine this capacity in the legal and political framework. When the legal mechanisms are unsuited to the cultural and political context, as they are today, the problems associated with capitalism and with institutional capture thrive. Citizens' assemblies are increasingly demonstrating that they can be used to address complex and controversial legislative matters, and they could function equally well at a transnational level. But what kind of legal structure would increase citizens' capacity to engage with EU lawmaking more concretely? The political institutionalization of participatory instruments is an underexplored area. Successful cases of deliberative citizens' assemblies are generating media attention, but there is little scholarly consideration given to the matter of its institutionalization. There is also relatively little academic research addressing executive and legislative capture at the EU level, where special interests increasingly dominate legislative processes. The disproportionate influence of special interest groups or on legislative proposals is known to insiders and anti-corruption practitioners, but only vaguely understood in academic circles. Empirical research would be helpful in the development of effective strategies for insulating decision makers from opportunities for personal benefit. An analysis of the Court of European Justice's legal reasoning may offer a working framework for analysis which has broader relevance. The anticipated implications of the results will contribute to social and academic debates in the area of citizen participation and to the scholarship on the functional capacity of law. It is hoped that this analysis may help in identifying the potential for institutionalization and encourage the sponsoring of appropriate litigation. The Treaty of Lisbon states that the EU institutions must, quote, give citizens the opportunity to make known and publicly exchange their views in all areas of Union action, and, quote, conduct their work as openly as possible. Participation in the decision-making process is a fundamental right, yet citizens recognize that they are being excluded from participating in decisions that are transforming their social, cultural, and economic future. The participatory mechanisms introduced as responses to the decision-making legitimacy problem are widely perceived to be inadequate. If decision-making does not allow for public scrutiny or public deliberation, it lacks legitimacy. While openness may be a treaty aspiration, the public perception of the deliberative process as secretive and contaminated by special interests has not been altered, regardless of the augmented role of the Parliament. This, by all accounts, is a problem of major consequence to the future of the European Union. Will it fall upon the Court of Justice to uphold the observance of institutional openness and citizen participation? Could the practices of participatory governance directly involving citizens be embedded into a political framework? A committee for the future and a citizens' second chamber of the EU Parliament have been proposed. A citizens' observatory that would formally engage the public in the decision-making process has also been suggested. Highly facilitated settings enable groups to constructively address policy issues, coming to reasoned decisions about preferred options. Such settings reveal not what people do think, but what they would think under close to ideal democratic conditions, informed, respectful, and deliberative. Institutionalizing a permanent citizens' chamber alongside the elected chamber would offer a secondary effect of educating citizens in critical thinking and deliberative methods. It might also offer the type of civic education lacking in many European Union member states. In 2019, the Committee on Constitutional Affairs of the EU Parliament went on a fact-finding mission and concluded that, quote, Article 25 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union presents a unique potential to reflect the new dimensions for the future evolution of rights of EU citizens, unquote. While the expansion of these citizens' rights, it is suggested, lie with the member states and the Commission, it is highly unlikely that either would venture to confer additional rights to citizens. Rather, it will be up to European activists and EU reform advocates themselves to take the initiative by proposing a governance model best suited for our times. The Article 2 social rights and values established in the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU, which include rule of law, freedom, pluralism, tolerance, solidarity, and non-discrimination, must be protected, not only from further breaches by member states, but also by violations by EU institutions themselves. To sum up, European Union constitutional architecture is particularly suited to establish a political body composed of citizens deliberating on policy. With some exceptions, academics fail to see the practices of corruption because they have no experience of engagement in the decision-making processes. European Union institutions are compromised, not just member states who are reproached for failing to adhere to the rule of law and other union values. Both the case law of the European Code of Justice and certain treaty provisions provide a promising basis for extending the decision-making abilities and modifying the governance structure. While there's little time here to delve into the details of Hannah Arendt's unusual critique of liberal and representative democracy, we may draw on Arendt's prescient and persistent distinction between sovereignty and freedom, and her distaste for abstraction. We may see in much of her work a number of overlaps between the objectives of European direct democracy advocates, the valuing of pluralistic and public deliberation, and the denial of the pretense of a unitary national will, her emphasis on the critical role of active civic engagement, and her rejection of all forms of political community based on tradition, religion, or ethnic identity. She saw through the contrived stability of representative democracy maintained by the state and perceived that its shapeless structure and fluctuating hierarchy make predictability, trust, and accountability impossible. In her book, The Human Condition, Arendt identified the fictive narratives of government order and laid out novel conditions for political legitimacy and political agency. Thank you very much for your attention. That was the paper. If there are any straightforward questions, I think I might be able to try and tackle them.
Thanks for the presentation, and please do send us thanks to Christiana for sending it. It's a great shame she couldn't be here. Yeah, if there are any questions on that, then the floor is open. All right.
Okay.
So, Thomas, we'd be honored to have you stick around to participate in the panel discussion.
Great. Thank you.
I guess so we're scheduled for that to start in 20 minutes, but we can bring that up, bring that forward. Do we want to take a couple of minute break before we get onto that? All right. Okay. So we'll get back together at, I guess, 5:02, and go from there. And this should be a really interesting discussion because I think some really interesting stuff has come up in these talks, and I can't wait to see how you guys bounced around. So, see you all in 2. All right. since there's only 10 of us here, I guess the format we'll take is I got some questions. If anyone else has questions they want to put to the panel, or if any panelists have questions that they want to put to the each other and to the floor, then we can. I guess I will sort of guide the who's speaking next. I'll sort of facilitate that. If you're on the floor and you want to speak to a point, feel free to raise a hand. We can afford to have a little, given the small numbers of people here, we can afford to be a little more relaxed about who gets to speak and who just has to listen. So we'll give everybody a minute to get back together, and then we'll kick off, I think. All right, let's give everyone a moment to get back online, and then we can start the panel discussion. Ian, go ahead.
I have a long form question. Feel free to cut me off at any point. Tell me if this is the right time for me to have that kind of long form question, or we should wait to kind of introduce discussion topics first.
Well, I wait so Thomas, Violeta, and Suryamayi, if you want to, when you're back and ready to go, if you could turn your cameras on, and then we'll start the discussion. Obviously, if you can't turn your cameras on for whatever reason, just let us know and we can start the discussion anyway. So in terms of sort of discussion topics, sortition and socialism, there's a huge range of topics there to touch on. But yeah, perfectly happy to kick off with a question from you, Ian, and we will go from there and sort of continue thematically from there. And then if we can sort of drain one topic dry, then I got a bunch of stuff ready to ask here. So we shouldn't be short of material.
Sounds good. Okay. My question is regarding how we advance the sovereignty of sortition. What is the most effective path? Should we have an all approaches strategy, or should we try to focus on specific strategies? I'm going to kind of briefly talk about my theory of sovereignty, or what I feel like is an appropriate theory of sovereignty, and then talk about where the legitimacy of sortition comes from, and kind of briefly describe where the potential strategies of advancing the sovereignty of sortition, as my understanding is. So for me, the sovereignty of...
Sorry.
Yeah.
So the question is, how can you advance the sovereignty of sortition? If you can give a brief explain on what you mean, just what you mean by sovereignty there, and then we'll open the question to the floor, and we can bring it back to you as part of that discussion, rather than you kicking off with your answer.
Right. That sounds good. So I define sovereignty kind of briefly in my question to Dr. Vergara earlier, is control of nature. Basically, from territorial animals to nations, the ability to gatekeep nature is the source of power. And it's played a very important role in most conflicts, as well as in domestic disputes. Like an obvious example would be like the enclosure movement. And United Kingdom, Ireland, as just a way to gatekeep access to nature and therefore the ability of someone to sustain their own life or the life of their lives of their families. And sovereignty over control of natural resources and land is currently held at the national level. And in a kind of a similar related way, sovereignty of sortition would be that the decisions made by sortition assemblies, sortition bodies, are taken seriously and have real effects on the level of who controls nature, who's able to have control over gatekeeping land, natural resources.
Cool. So does anyone want to take that to begin with?
Yes.
Camila, go ahead.
Yes. So thank you for this idea, provocation, question, comment. It's all very interesting. The problem I see with sovereignty as a concept is that is based on absolute power and is a fiction that began with the monarchs. The idea that basically property, personal property, it was equal to public property or public goods in a way. There's a merger. So when it passes to popular sovereignty, then we have this fiction of total control, which is not good to begin with because it's a fiction. We cannot really control. Second, is it desirable? Is it control what we want? Is it to open the gates? So what is the control for in a way, right, in nature? And speaks to kind of a lack of boundaries. And I think a misunderstanding of what is the position of the human in the ecosystem. Because when we think about controlling nature, nature is outside of us, right? So there is an idea of conquest involved in the idea of sovereignty. So I do not believe, but this me personally as a philosopher, to basically bring that concept, which was based on domination and dominos, the idea of personal domination, into the kind of popular language or language of the left. I think that sovereignties in general has been, and there's like the sovereignist movements. I understand that you need to control, the territory in order for it to be decommodified in a way. You need to have control as a nation coming from the global south. If you have no sovereignty over your resources, you are basically owned by the companies abroad. So you have no control. You want sovereignty, but what do you want sovereignty for? So here, the work of Thea Riofrancos, she is an expert on extractivism. She has done kind of rights of nature in Ecuador and the extractivist populism. So basically controlling the nature in order to give it to the many, if you will, which is kind of something desirable, but it is against nature and against ourselves in a way. It is a way of basically replacing corporations plundering the earth for their own benefit to the state plundering the earth, which is the same thing, but giving a little bit more to the people in a way and changing somewhat the structure. But you're replicating the same as election replicates even the bad things inside the common assemblies. I think thinking about sovereignty in that idea of absolute control is misguided, I would say, or I would say let's think about other concepts in a way that are less top down, because kind of it brings me some kind of noise in the analysis. The rule of sortition is also kind of problematic, I would say, because sortition again is a process, is a method. What is it? What do we mean by sortition? For me, is more a process of equal selection, if you will, of the equal political judgment that could translate into many things. But if we give sovereignty or rulership to kind of institution, whatever that is not the people. Only if the people is really assembling, if we have a process, as was said before, as a process that is impossible to be ossified and controlled in a way that is so organic and dynamic and so encompassing that can really be the rule of the people. But this is not something that we think about when we think about sortition, right? So we need to really stretch the boundaries there. So I think for the rest of the panel, I would say really, what do we mean by sortition, and what kind of power should sortition have within the system of and the idea of popular liberation, which is not against nature. We are nature in a way. We are all divine, if you will. Yeah, we are all part of the ecosystem. So we need to think about ourselves in a different manner, and the left in a different manner, to not replicate the same things as before.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else on the panel want to speak to that briefly before we bounce it back to Ian for his follow-up? All right, Ian, go ahead.
Let me clarify. I think I believe very strongly, morally, in the right for all people to rule themselves and in cooperative governance. But the reason that I bring up the concept of sovereignty is I think there's always the threat of a force outside of this cooperative governance for taking over, for unseating the people as their own rulers, whether that's a corporation or whether that's a hegemonic power like the United States. And I think so having control of nature, not meaning in a destructive or exploitative way, but just legitimately having the power to assert control over a territory, irrespective of the type of control that's used. The type of control that I'm in favor of is definitely working with nature to control things cooperatively as the people together, and to give people as much individual liberty and freedom over themselves as possible while protecting society. That being said, I feel like there's that sovereignty, the power to control natural resources and gatekeep and exclude others, and basically threaten their very lives, is held at the national level. And most federated systems, whether they are states or cities, counties subservient to a national government, or international governments that try to pull together different nations, none of those powers have sovereignty. And it's just because it's that control of nature, not meaning to exploit, no judgment on how one controls nature, but the ability to control a space, to implement the type of control you wish, which in my case is definitely
like
a cooperative
who has the
control.
gunpoint veto?
Right, who has the gunpoint veto?
Well, if I can respond very briefly from my perspective, which is particular. It's not I'm saying not you're wrong or whatever. It's just what I think. So sovereignty, the same as the concept of right, comes from the idea of property. Property is at the base of both sovereignty, dominion over, and therefore property that I can use and abuse, exclude others, as you say. And is, as Marx says basically a barrier among us, within us. I exclude you. And when we're talking about nature, if you think about having sovereignty over nature, you're talking about having the relation of property over nature. And that is already a capitalist way of thinking, because we are enmeshed, and capitalism is, the ideological foundations come before. They're even feudal in a way. They have mutated. Caterina Pistor wrote this great book, The Code of Capital, in which explains, this development of law and how it was not really a break. It was really, forms of domination coming from before. So property is the cornerstone. And from, a left perspective, and from kind of nature is going to end, we are going to end as a species if we don't do something in a way in this planet. We cannot relate to nature in the form of property. And I can just say, in the terms of the greatest achievements of law, international law, in terms of a protection of nature and giving sovereignty to the right people, if you will, the indigenous peoples of the Amazon, in the rulings, they are recognized as the property owners of that territory. But they themselves, that tribe does not recognize themselves as property. They look at nature as property. Because how can you be the owner of nature? This is absurd in their cosmology, and it should be to us as well. Like nature is of all of us in a way. The commons are not to be owned. So the idea of excluding others in a moment of environmental crisis in which you will have migration for few resources around the world rings all kinds of bells to me, which it kind of brings all the kind of tribalness in a way. And sortition could just reinforce that, as elections reinforce things. But we need to think critically in a way about the concepts that we're using today, because of they're all concepts that replicate relationships with things and our role in it. And I understand that you want to be, you want autonomy, which, is different. Self-determination comes separated from your property of the territory. So the indigenous tribes understand themselves as guardians. And of course, they live in the territory and it's their duty to guard that land. But that land is not theirs in a way. In the relation with the West, they have understood themselves as the owners of that land. One thing is to control it, that you live there, you're dwellers, but the other is to really own it. And what does it mean? That you can exclude others, that you can use and abuse it, you can burn it if you want, that you can exert profit from it, right? That you can manage it in certain manner. So there are many, rights that come in the idea of property. And it has the exclusion of others is a very problematic one. And of course, we need to deal with it at the local level, because what are you going to do? So for me, is thinking about how do we include others in that control, that is not property-like, but is guardianship-like of the territory. Because we need to be able, as a basic rule, to include others. We cannot create walls. For that we have other people that do that, right? that build walls around. That doesn't mean that we need to be vulnerable. So I am completely with you in the sense that when you have kind of a foreign element, if you will, of, solidarity and self-rule in a sea of, oligarchic rule and, inequality, you're going to be going to be fighting, and you need to survive in a way. What are the rules and mechanisms and things that you need in order to survive as this foreign object? I think one of them is to connect to other foreign objects that are proliferating, but they're alone, and they just, their energy goes down because they don't have that flow in a way. But we cannot build our new relations or prefigure, our futures from all concepts that belong to property. And if we're coming from socialism, property is something that is a political relation, and therefore we need to define what it is. It's not a natural right, and this is the difference between liberalism and socialism. So we need to really think from those kind of socialist principles that even before liberalism, I would say, is useful. I don't have an answer, but I think that is, my opinion.
Thanks. Does anyone else on the panel want to speak to that before we move on? All right. So Suryamayi, you talked. One of the things you noted in your talk was the on the subject of exclusion and sortitional institutions and the role of exclusion in building this prefigurative politics of a better world. One of the things you noted was that the fact that the Citizens' Assembly excluded the usual suspects who dominate the discussion in the full assemblies, that helped promote the inclusion of the people who were otherwise excluded. I was just wondering if you could speak a little to the role of what is if we're talking about democracy and a democracy from the social level and a sort of a social revolution in which the power is in the hands of the people. What is the role of exclusion from various decision-making processes in that? It's a question for the whole panel, but Suryamayi, if you want to start us off, and then we can go around.
Thanks, Oliver. I think that's a really important question, even though it is a controversial one. I think it's a question that we do need to ask ourselves. especially in, direct democratic settings in which, people there is universal access. So the first thing I want to say, though, to clarify, is that the Citizens Assembly pilot in Orville didn't exclude anyone. So everyone was within the pool of people that could be randomly selected. It just was seen as a good tool to kind of break up, let's say, ossified kind of habits of who would tend to dominate meetings. So it was a way to kind of break up those, those entrenched kind of habits in a small community of kind of autonomy and hierarchy and power, and how that would play out. So it really kind of broke that up. So it wasn't so much, or it wasn't at all actually about excluding people, but about changing the dynamic between these different actors. And I think that,
but in practice, part of the reason that it worked was that a whole lot of those actors just weren't in the room.
So no, some of those actors were in the room, actually. So this was really interesting. We did have some of those actors selected, and I'm thinking of one in particular who, interestingly, was somebody who really embraced the idea that actually power in the community should be held hierarchically, even though the culture was that it would be horizontal. You did have a few people who felt like, actually, there are some of us who kind of know better and who are more experienced, and all of that, and we should be in charge. There is a clique. It's a small clique, but that clique does exist, and that person was within that clique, specifically around town planning, which is one of the really big subject of contention in Orville right now, and it's really interesting in terms of Camila was just discussing, the concept of space and kind of who owns space and operates space and decides how space is used and how inherently political that is, and this conception in Orville of how utopias have in the past at some point have been conceived of as cities and as spaces that were clearly planned and used in a certain way. And so in Orville, that particular issue is there's a friction between that idea that it has to be planned and designed, in order to facilitate the best outcomes, and the idea that actually, if we just trust the process and the society that is developing to use the space in evolving ways to meet its own needs. So you really had these kind of, it's an issue that really brought to light the kind of grassroots approach, evolving approach versus a kind of top-down approach. And this person was really within this top-down clique. And actually, at the end of the process, he was like, oh, we should use citizens' assemblies, for everything. We should use it for this town planning topic that's, that's such an issue. So we did have some of those people in the room. And but what was interesting is that they weren't able to use space in the way that they were able to use space, and I mean the space of authority in a process as in these general assemblies. And I think that maybe that is the first step, not just exclusion, upright, because I think that is very problematic to consider in a democratic context, evidently, but really around sort of safeguards and processes and ways of deliberating, like Camila mentioned some earlier from the Chilean example, kind of how to organize space so that the way that authority is held and the power that it has is diffused, not by excluding them, but by actually prefiguring a culture and lifting other voices up to kind of like fulfill that. That said, there is a really interesting discussion. It's a recording. It's on Occupy Wall Street, and how they had to deal with actually this issue of exclusion, and that actually they arrived at the same kind of conclusion, which was that at some point when we have these people that are so overbearing, because we're in a kind of direct democratic context in which we're not having this held facilitated space, then actually we do need to consider saying, hey, you're not kind of respecting others in the space, and you kind of need to like take a step back and come back, when you're ready, it sounds sort of almost like speaking to a child. That's why I'm laughing. It's kind of like, come back to the room when you calm down, sort of thing. So it's interesting to see that even in that space, which was, really upheld these kind of principles of direct democracy, that even they came up against that challenge. And so maybe maybe there is a space for saying you're not completely excluded from this process overall, but if you can't, engage in a certain respectful way, then you need to take a step back for at least for a time. And that's what comes up in response to your question.
Camila, go ahead.
Yes, yeah. So I don't see. So I see exclusions having a very important role, because if there's, in order to be replicable, for me, there are communities in which there are leaders that have too much power to be in an assembly of equals in a way. So if we're going to think about sortition as, the method of equals, then we need to really think critically of who holds power, right, in the society and can have a bad influence. So bring inequality with them to the assembly. And there's, of course, theorists that say, well, we need to exclude the rich. For me, it just that is not really, not because you're rich, you're going to have power over people. You have power indirectly over people, but you don't have, authority vis-a-vis just regular citizens. You have no power over them. However, religious leaders, if you have a priest or, anyone that is a leader of a community, then, and your power is social, you're going to have the same power in that assembly. So that person is not going to be, if you're going to question, he's going to speak from a moment of, from a place of authority. And if there's people that are in their community that go to that church, they're going to feel that he's, from the pulpit in a way. And when you go to church, it's like, it's not up for, your opinion. So you can sway people. So I think the exclusions need to be, in the sense that you need to have a criteria of selection. And of course, you don't select them. Anybody that has, a social, leadership, and you need to be, of course, contextual. And of course, government officials and their staff in a way. Because judges, how can you have a judge inside an assembly? Of course, he knows better on judgment, kind of like he's an authority within. So I think we do exclusions all the time, make exclusions all the time in our criteria. So I think exclusions are crucial, but not, and I would say I go with you that if you exclude people, you will not have the legitimacy that you need in order to be kind of for a general, if you exclude the rich, you don't have their, their point of view. You don't have their consent. And if you exclude right-wing people or conservative people, this is the same. Some of my allies in the convention were, rural conservatives, because they understood that, popular participation when you're in the margins, it's necessary in order to, relate to the center. So we came across, and I am a kind of a democracy activist that, goes throughout all the parties in a way, support some of them that were grassroots. The more institutionalized, the less they, approve that. But basically, you cannot exclude your, potential allies because they have never participated into this deliberation. As you say, there's so much research on the kind of social desire and the social endorphins, basically, that you produce, and actually the depression that comes after when you are not engaged anymore and you go to your private life and there's like no power, no enrichment of your life, and you go back to your cubicle in a way, people get very depressed. So I think exclusions are necessary to allow for that richness to, be happening, and not to the assembly to be swayed, because if we're going to replicate, this is going to be threatening to power. Whatever that is threatening to power is going to be co-opted immediately, or tried at least. So for me, immediately I start, thinking about the ways that you need to kind of, limit that optation potential through exclusion.
Great. So Suryamayi, looks like you may have to leave shortly, but I hope we've got time for one more question round. So this one, I guess, what we got? Okay. How do we build coordination capacity? I want to, Thomas, I want to give you one question before we move on to this. So you're working in a more loyally capacity, and in the context of EU institutions. And when we're talking about participation and non-participation, Christiana's paper discussed the involvement of citizens and participation through sortitional institutions in the European Union processes. And obviously the European Union got a population of 500 million people. so the actual number of people who are going to participate in a sort of citizens European Parliament, or even in a regular citizens assemblies or other institutions there, is going to be proportionally very small. So how do we achieve the benefits of participation in terms of these different levels of government, sort of from and institutions, from political parties to municipalities to national governments to international organizations? What are the, if you're looking at trying to make the EU more participatory in this example, how do you handle that question of scale? You're muted. You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, it's an enormous challenge, obviously. There are, I mean, it's a question of, are there opportunities available? If there are, let's see what we can do with them. So the paper was suggesting that the EU institutions, fundamental institutions of the EU, are, let's say, amenable enough to initiatives, from popular initiatives. So one kind of strategy that can be used and is used today is that, for example, if there were an interest in creating a citizen chamber, a kind of bicameral system where you would have a sortition chamber or something like that. This could be affected. This could be affected by making a proposal to the European Commission to initiate what is called a European Citizens Initiative. Now, this is something that can exist. It's a transnational referendum, which, if it's successful, it can be presented to the Commission in the hope that they would launch legislation on that topic. So I think you need at least participants from at least 7 European countries, EU countries, I mean, a minimum of 1 million signatures collected within 1 year. And now, that doesn't guarantee that some proposal like a European Citizens Initiative to institute a sortitional chamber or some change to the Constitution. But that could then be challenged in the European Court of Justice. So you have a certain flexibility, you have a certain ability institutionalized already, which allows for bottom-up initiatives, and people can be motivated to do that. Obviously, this is the same problem that would exist in any kind of polity. I mean, how do you encourage people to engage? But the European Union does have this, at least this kind of potential for citizens' initiatives.
Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, mine is primarily a comment, because what I've gotten from today's discussion, sometimes we on the left can get caught up in visionary concepts that don't seem practical and engaging unless we have complete revolution, you know. But what I got from this discussion today, it was that there were a lot of practical things that we can do on a day-to-day level within the societies or the systems that we're involved in. For example, the idea of familiarizing people with the procedures of sortition and the procedures related to deliberative democracy without having a citizens' assembly. The idea of using sortition, something we gave a workshop to teachers about how they could integrate sortition ideas and deliberative democracy. We said, start using just, random selection for kids asking questions, simple stuff to familiarize the populace with the concepts first. Because, when I talk to people now about using sortition as a global or as a broad means of change, like in our democracy here in the United States, they go, yeah, right. That's not going to ever happen. So we have to really lay the groundwork. We have to work at it from both sides. It's competing priorities. And what I heard today, the idea, the model of the mycelium model, I think is a great model. The adding to instead of feeling like we have to tear down and completely build up, which I think we on the left, and I could be just speaking for myself, sometimes feel like we have to do. These ideas might ultimately reach over to the right, which is, to me, the biggest challenge for us is how can we engage the right to see that these concepts will benefit them as well, that they don't have to run to autocratic or fascist kinds of philosophy in order to feel less disenfranchised in maybe a liberal democracy. I just wanted to make the comment that I feel like from all the speakers, we were able to extract, or I was able to extract things that now I feel, oh, okay, this wasn't just philosophy. This wasn't just, up here in this level, but I can actually extract these things and then engage in the communities that I'm involved with. And I think that's going to help a lot of us that get frozen when people say, yeah, that'll never happen, or how we have to describe, or how we want to describe sortition or deliberative democracy to people that have never heard anything about it. If we can introduce some of these concepts, I think it's just going to go a long way. And I just wanted to thank all the speakers for providing that, because practicality really is the most important to me. So thank you.
Thank you, Rich. Camila.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It makes, warms my heart. It's excellent. So I have one response, going back to business, I'm sorry, to the situation of having a dual chamber. We can see it as you say, kind of bringing, people's demands up, or you can see it as an oligarchic takeover or control of something that could be actually a game changer, because it depends on the powers that you're going to attribute to this chamber. If the chamber has just the power to initiate law, it means that it needs to go to the oligarchic electoral chamber, and it's going to be watered down, it's going to be, limited, and then it's going to be sold as like the people have spoken, because basically it's not only the representatives, but it's actually this, sortition-based citizen assembly, regular citizens that are applying, like saying yes. So you are disciplining, you're using I think, the people and the people who are residents, who are not part of power, that are unconstrained by how the power works, have a creative way that other people don't, in a way. That is what, kind of common sense and the common lived experience. So if you try to discipline that and make it work in the oligarchic structure, you're not going to bring the creativity, you're going to tame it. In a way, representation and everything is, in a way, enabling the taming of this creative spirit. So it depends on the rules. If you, for example, have that chamber, and as a chamber, you have the power to call a referendum on your proposal, and you have direct contact with the people, and you can pass a legislation wholesale, and your way, in a way, with popular approval, yes, that's a game changer. But that is not what is being proposed, and it's not going to fly anywhere, at least not now, right? Because in a way, it's all about giving space and inclusion to these new ideas and citizens being included in power, in a way, when power really corrupts and confuses things, in a way. Now we are inside power, so how can we criticize power if we're inside and we are legitimizing, this, and what is left after that, right? So in a way, all these things are ours, become, part of the system, which we are trying to, change. So if we talk about, environmental change, how can we really push for keep the oil on the ground, for example, like something radical like that is common sense, but radical, just like no more leases, something that will never fly. If you go to the parliamentary chamber, that initiative will never fly, will be, gradual, 30 years, whatever. So it is going to be watered down because there's lobbyists working full time to, influence their way in. So you kind of detooth it. So for me, is keep them separate. Understand the people's chamber or the citizen assembly as a counterpower, not as part of power, because then everything gets confused. And I think it's a very clever way of kind of like trying to make it work, but we need to think like the perspective. What is happening? Is it really a bottom-up citizen demand or a co-optation from above in a way? So that would be my perspective in general. And I would say I would be a little bit, more not against what Rich just said, but I don't think that sortition as a kind of as a belief that we are all equal and therefore we are all equally, being able to be selected and having equal power can be really understood only intellectually. It really needs to be experienced. So I think all what Suryamayi just brought, basically, the experience of, people changing their minds. This is what we are, people having common sense. So the environmental beat, for example, you go and you have a problem in your community of pollution. It doesn't matter what you vote. You will be in favor of basically having, a free or pollution environment free of pollution, and having more power to control, in a way, the community rights, and not just be at the mercy of the next government or the next bureaucracy, because people demobilize, right? So I think when you integrate it into the schools, for example, to have activities in which they experience randomness, for example, having randomly selected parts in a theater. So one of the experiences, I don't know if maybe run late, but one of the practices that I did teaching constitutional law at a pre-law level was to select part of the constitutional debates in the US and assign parts randomly. And basically the student needed to do a little bit of research on the person, but also not only biographical, like, thin, but also how do they make a living? Where did the money comes from? Which is a question that we don't really ask in a way, So, and from that kind of material perspective, play the part well, not like their opinion. So they had to then, randomly, so they were assigned these parts randomly, and then they need to give your opinion in the debate in character. So from their perspective, and then we will switch up, and then we did it all over again in a way. And other people that were a slave owner had to, be, commercial elite, and all these things that happened, and they would understand it better, that how randomly experience different things that is not your belief in a way is so liberating in a way, that you need to play a part, and it's not your investment. You're doing something that is communitary, first of all, like an experiment in a way, a collective experience that gives you energy in a way, different than today, the isolation with the social media and everything. It's just necessary to have that experience. So it's experimental in the sense that you need to experience it. If we don't understand sortition only as a procedure, right? Or as a citizen assembly, but something wider, that would be my response. Thank you.
Thanks. So Suryamayi, I understand you have to run. Do the other 7 of us want to stick around a little while? The conference is scheduled for the next 20 minutes, so we got time for a little more discussion if we're all up for that.
I would like to leave 10 minutes early if it's possible, because I have to pick up my son in Brooklyn. So it's like a very left, for an hour from here.
That's quite all right. Oh, wait, well, we got time for one more. In which case, yeah, just kind of a follow on from that. How do we, between sort of power and counterpower, we're saying, okay, well, a certain institution is being added to the European Union or to a local council or whatever it might be, and there's going to be a certain amount of some of the people setting that up are going to be trying to co-opt it, right? And some of the people involved in setting it up are going to be trying to like foster its sort of radical potentialities. How do we navigate that? How do we? Because I mean, so the example that comes to my mind is, during sort of the age of revolutions, when you're having these sort of bourgeois revolutions, and very often the king would be like, okay, well, we're gonna have like the Estates General, or we're gonna have some kind of compromise parliament, and we're all gonna keep it under control, and it's not gonna burst out of control and execute me. and then obviously that didn't quite work out as planned, right? So how do we navigate that with sortitional institutions?
That's a terrific question. I would like Suryamayi to please talk about time, because this is crucial, the timing of everything. I can relate a little bit of my experience in which time is the most disciplinary, in a way, that having a fast process when you have like a deliberation going on, it's against you in a way. But sometimes having a fast process in the sense that you have X amount of meetings is very difficult for something to be co-opted. So if you are going to, we thought about having a kind of tribune of the plebs, randomly selected, as you know, John McCormick has, from Chicago has proposed. But my perspective and the perspective in Chile was more about a defender of human rights. So basically of socioeconomic rights. So if you have a neoliberal country that you need, you know, socioeconomic rights, how are you going to do it? You can do it through legislation, right? Through presidential action, policy, right? You can also do it through the courts. So in a way, you can push an institution that can, you know, deliver those cases or those, you know, findings and push for change coming from below in a way. So citizen assemblies that come with like topics, like it could maybe not a survey, but if you do it as a citizen assembly, you will come with the topics and you will further explore and basically have your own agenda separated from the powers that be. So when you have a representative institution, you need very short span, you know, times, because if not, time will allow more reach in a way, or access. It's like the more it's like a osmosis in a way, or like a breaking of thermodynamic, you know, barrier. The more you are in power, or the more you are in contact with people that can influence you, the more you will get influenced. So in a way, you need to do it like short. But the sortition, if you're going to have an institution based on that, if it's connected to a process that is grassroots, for example, then you need time. So I think we need to think about the different interfaces and not just, you know, kind of as a one thing that we can incorporate, because it always, as the kind of the mycelium thing, you always need to be connected to the grassroots, because even if you have a perfect sortition institution, it will always be 200 people that will be there at a time. Even if you do it like rotation, like you know, super fast, you will maybe never be selected, you know? So this is you're not experiencing citizenship, and then you're not becoming, you know, an active agent. You're still a consumer of politics. You just transferred your authority from, you know, the legitimacy of law and policy from the legislative or, you know, representative to another chamber that is these citizens, but it's like weaker, because basically nobody has, it's just random people in a way. You need to really have like a narrative of, you know, pro common sense, you know, random people, you know, wisdom, if you will. But if not, it's, you know, difficult, you know, and if we're going to really have the sortition as a kind of a process and as a mode of being, if you will, that we are equals and judgment needs to be exercised in order to be human in a way, we need to take part. This is needed of us. We cannot unburden ourselves from us. It's necessary and it's enjoyable in a way. Then we need to really think about institutions being expansive and not just like, okay, we're going to just do this hack and that's it in a way. That would not, you know.
Suryamayi, before you have to run off, do you want to speak to that point?
Yes, I'd like to pick up actually on. I mean, there was a lot of things that were shared. So I don't know, Oliver, specifically what you wanted me to speak to, but one of the things that Camila opened with was saying if I could speak to kind of the notion of time. So I can respond to that, unless there was something else you wanted me to address specifically.
That's perfect.
So first of all, I do think that is really critical to consider in terms of deliberative processes, because a lot of the criticism that we get, not just from, I mean, both from participants and from those that are expecting the outcomes, is that they take too much time. So a lot of participants end up saying, actually, you know, you can't ask me to participate in these endless, you know, decision-making processes that have no end. I'm not that rich in time. So one of the things that we did in the CA pilot was to really try our best to respect participants' time and to really kind of really work on the efficiency of the process. I think that as much as we would like to give space for people to kind of really work together, dialogue and all of this, at some point it's just, we need to balance those with the actual needs of the people and their ability to participate, and also consider that perhaps adding more time is not always going to lead to a better decision or to better relationships. That again, following with Camila, I think we really do need to question this relationship with time and with like endless amounts of time that we allocate to decision-making processes. Also, particularly when there are emergency decisions that need to be taken. So in the Orwell context, which operates primarily, as a direct democracy, we actually have two tracks of decision-making. We have our regular decision-making processes, which go through a General Assembly, which, there's sort of a poll, a kind of pulse taken to see whether we're ready to take it to a vote. If we're not ready, then people need to go back, present the topic again, bring more evidence, whatever it might be. But we also have an emergency decision, residence assembly decision-making process, whereby people just present evidence. There's no time for like discussing, and you kind of vote yes, no, and there's a 48-hour time. So I think we need to be realistic about the time that people can spend on processes, and about the time frame that we have to actually deliver decisions on certain topics based on what is needed out of those outcomes. Definitely.
Yeah. Thomas, do you want to speaking to the question of how do we sneak radical potentialities into these sort of institutions that kind of have to get the approval of existing institutions in order to get a foothold? So in the context of you're talking about, European Union institutions that has to get through the various bodies that have to sign off on that. How would you think about trying to get that radical potential in there, sort of under their noses, or despite the best efforts of those bodies to keep it in its box?
Well, I think it involves trust. I think it involves trust of the process. I mean, there's so much what is described as sober second thought. This is the idea of the bicameral system, that what flies at one level can be shot down at the next, and that is just an exercise in frustration. And I've seen it many times. For example, in Canada, that in the 1980s, this was going back a long way, there were popular consultations about the Constitution. At great expense, the government did a national consultation with citizens groups. The results were completely ignored, as is often the case. So, there's no guarantee that anything is going to be considered to have any value at all, unless these things are no longer considered to be consultative. They're considered to be binding. We're gonna actually resolve this issue. This is not so that we can get some input, which we can then and haw over and then just ignore. So there has to be a commitment. There has to be a trust. And the trust, I think, comes from maturity, from people having experience, from undergoing the process. There has to be a faith that something is going to change in people by engaging.
So sorry, just a clarifying question. When you say there has to be trust, who is it that has to trust the process? Is it the ordinary citizens, or is it the bureaucrats and the European politicians?
It's the ordinary citizens. It's the people who are going to ultimately say, this matters. I'm not engaging in building castles in the air. This is not a debating society that I'm joining, but this is going to be something meaningful.
Camila, you want to speak to that point real quick?
Yes. So I think here, and I need to leave, but I think we need to think about the ways that have been, the voice of the people have been binding in the past and in the present, right? And one of it is basically a referendum or plebiscite, right? So there's where the people speak, supposedly, or we can all, as individuals, not as a collective, as individuals, we, go and say yes or no to something. And of course, when we take only the plebiscite as it is, like a thin procedure, it can be easily manipulated. People don't go to vote. You have, skewed propaganda. You have very short period of socialization of the topic. You can do many things for it to be lost. Imagine the constituent process in Chile. It was a constitution that gave more rights to people that are in precarity, basically. They were going to gain from it, but we had 28 days to socialize the text. So it was bound to fail in a way, in the sense of kind of binding that trust, because it's one fake news that says that you're going to be worse off, and you will back off. Like, you will say no, because you are afraid in a way. You were not in the process involved. If you were involved, you don't care about the fake news, because you know more in a way. You know what is fake and what is not. But if you're outside the process, like the general public, it's very difficult. So thinking about sortition as a process in which we're all equal on this, and not as a procedure, maybe we need to think about a combined a strategy in which we have a process that is longer in a way, that starts in the citizen assembly and goes back to the people. And in that going back to the people for referendum needs to be a deliberation of like really pedagogical ways, in a way in which we can, have to be citizen assemblies or residence assemblies in a way in each locality, just to socialize what the citizen assembly has proposed in a way. And not through media, through propaganda, but actually, let's look at what they're saying. And maybe we can go and have testimony and do the same kind of procedure that was described in India, basically, and do it in these individual settings, and then go to referendum. And then you can have a complete process. I would say one without the other. So having a citizen assembly without binding power and without a thing that we all know who won or not, like we really have power, yes or no, right? We need that in a way. And having only a plebiscite in which we say yes or no with no information is equally, bad in a way. We need to merge it, having kind of more direct democratic. If it's citizen initiative, it needs to end with the people as well. And that means not just expression of will, but actually learning together and kind of apply the sortition principles, if you will, to the whole process. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you all so much. Thomas, go ahead right before we finish. You're on mute still.
Yeah, absolutely true that it's absolutely true that one phase of this is not enough. So an example I can give is the way that what are called national consultations are used here in Hungary, which is where I'm based. The national consultations, which are quite frequently from the authoritarian Fidesz regime here, are simply used as a rubber stamp. There's nothing fishy about the process. I mean, it is a national consultation. It's a referendum, but the referendum question, the nature of the participation, is all complete, bullshit. And so it is just a method of tightening the screws of control. So no one single thing is going to be effective on its own. Probably no double thing or triple thing either.
Right. Well, thank you so much for that. This has been a really fascinating conference. It's been great talking to you all and meeting you all. Yeah, thank you so much for participating. I've had a great time. I hope everybody else here has had a good time as well. Yeah, this has been brilliant. I hope we can do it again sometime.